Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity settles in, history slows its breathing, and even the heaviest stories are told in a gentler voice. Tonight, we are turning toward a night that has never quite left the human imagination. A night of bright electric light, polished wood, brass railings, cold air, steady music, and a silence that grew larger with every passing minute. Our subject is the Titanic, and more specifically, what really happened to her in those final minutes when certainty ran out. The deck changed under people's feet, and one of the most famous ships in the world stopped being a symbol and became a scene of very human confusion. It is a story most people think they already know. A great ship hits an iceberg, the ship sinks, there are lifeboats, there is panic, there is tragedy. And somewhere in the background a violin is always playing. That is the version that lives in memory, polished smooth by retellings, films, school lessons, and those late-night documentaries that somehow always seem to find you when you're only trying to watch one thing before bed. But when you slow the story down, when you stop treating it like a headline and begin listening for the ordinary details, it becomes stranger, quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. Because the final minutes of Titanic were not made of one single dramatic moment. They were built from dozens of smaller ones, a glance, a hesitation. A door opened, a boat lowered half full, a crewman following orders, a passenger refusing to leave the warmth of the dining room because the ship still looks solid enough to trust. There is something almost absurd about how disasters can begin. We imagine alarms, shouting, smoke, some grand theatrical signal from the universe saying, yes, this is the turning point, please pay attention. Real life is often less helpful. Sometimes catastrophe arrives, with a soft scrape along the side of a ship so slight that many people barely notice it. Sometimes the beginning of the end feels less like a blow and more like a correction, as though the world has gently tapped the shoulder of a thing it has already decided to take away. Titanic's final minutes only make sense when you remember that for a long stretch of time many people on board did not yet believe they were living inside a disaster. Some were worried, some were curious, some were annoyed at being made to dress warmly and go outside, some were asleep, some were joking. Human beings are very good at delaying belief when belief would be inconvenient, and perhaps that is part of why this story endures. It is not simply about a ship, it is about the lag between danger and understanding. It's about what people do when the familiar world still looks almost normal, even as it has already begun to fail beneath them. The carpets are still there, the lamps are still glowing, the china is still in place. The sea, meanwhile, has already entered the ship and started its work several decks below, cold and quiet and entirely uninterested in reputation. Before we go further, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. There is something fitting about that with this story, because time is the true ruler here. Not fame, not money, not engineering, not confidence. Just minutes, one after another, each one making the next decision harder than the last. And if you find this kind of slow, thoughtful storytelling calming or interesting, do consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps this little calm harbour find other listeners who might enjoy a quieter way into the past. I am very grateful you are here. Settle in now and let the room around you grow a little softer. We're going back to an April night in 1912, out into the North Atlantic, where the air was biting, the stars were sharp enough to seem almost near at hand, and the ocean had the peculiar stillness that sailors sometimes distrust. No wind to roughen the surface, no waves breaking white, just a dark plain stretching in all directions, deceptively neat, almost polite to look at. The sort of night that might appear peaceful from the deck of a large ship, though peace and safety are not always close relatives. Titanic herself was a floating world, and that mattered. It is difficult to grasp just how complete an environment she seemed to be. She was not a raft against nature, she was a miniature society wrapped in steel. There were grand staircases and cafes, smoking rooms and dining saloons, Kitchens running like clockwork, engines turning with enormous confidence below, stewards moving through passages, letters being written, shoes being removed, blankets being folded back. Life aboard a ship like that develops its own weather. After a few days, the vessel begins to feel less like transport and more like place. People settle into routines. They remember where the doors are. They complain about the temperature of tea. They become temporarily domesticated by the timetable and the carpets, and the idea that someone else is in charge of the important things. Once that feeling takes hold, it is remarkably hard to shake. That is one reason the final minutes unfolded the way they did. The people on Titanic were not standing on a bare platform waiting for disaster to announce itself. They were inside a carefully managed world designed to reassure them. The ship was modern, enormous, and widely admired. Her very size created psychological comfort. Large things feel dependable. A small boat in freezing water looks fragile because it is. A vast ocean liner with lit windows and several decks of rooms feels like architecture. It feels almost rude to imagine it failing. There is a quiet arrogance in scale. A ship big enough to carry libraries, musicians, mail, multiple classes of passengers, and enough cutlery to survive several very ambitious dinners begins to seem less like an object and more like a fact. And yet facts can crack. More often, they don't even crack in the dramatic way we expect. They simply stop holding. A little earlier in the evening, the ship had been warned about ice. More than once, in fact. That part is often presented as a grim, flashing sign ignored by careless men in caps. Reality, as usual, was more ordinary and therefore more believable. Wireless messages arrived. Conditions were discussed. There was awareness of ice in the area. The sea was cold enough. But ships at the time did not stop at every warning as though one message should freeze the whole Atlantic in place. Maritime travel involved judgment, habit, confidence, and a degree of risk that was considered acceptable right up until it was not. It is easy, looking backward, to sort all those warnings into one neat row of mischances. It did not feel neat in the moment. It felt like information in a busy system. Another message, another note, another calculation. Humans love hindsight because it tidies what reality leaves scattered. Then came the iceberg, appearing ahead in the darkness with far too little distance left to make the sort of difference people later wished for. The lookouts saw it. The bridge reacted. Orders were given. The ship turned. Engines were adjusted. There was motion, intent, effort. But the ship was immense, and immensity has a drawback. Once committed, it does not change its mind quickly. Titanic did not crash head-on in the simple way people often picture. She brushed along the iceberg. It was not the kind of collision that tossed passengers to the floor en masse. Many people felt very little. Some noticed a shiver. Some heard a scraping sound. Some barely paused in what they were doing. There is something chilling about that in a very practical sense. A disaster that announces itself too loudly at least gives everyone the courtesy of clarity. This one arrived in a manner easy to underestimate. Some passengers stepped out, curious. Others asked staff what had happened. A bit of ice reportedly found its way onto parts of the deck, which must have seemed almost comic for a moment, the sea sending over a souvenir with terrible manners. Imagine seeing a few chips of iceberg and thinking the ship has simply had a minor brush with the night. Imagine brushing ice crystals from your coat, while, below your feet, seawater is already forcing its way through damaged compartments. History is full of moments like that, where the visible detail is small and the invisible change is enormous. What followed was not instant chaos. It was assessment, inspection, calculation. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, is often remembered in this part of the story because he understood faster than many others what the damage meant. Water had entered too many compartments. Titanic had been built with watertight sections, and this feature gave both the ship and the public a sense of reassurance. The trouble was that those compartments were not a magic trick. They had limits. The damage crossed too many of them. The front of the ship would sink lower. Water would spill onward. The process, once started, could not be reversed by discipline, optimism, or polished brass. Andrews recognised that the ship was doomed. Not might be, was. That realisation is one of the great invisible hinges in the story. Somewhere on that ship, while many passengers still had no real idea what was happening, a small number of men understood that they were standing inside a machine already sentenced by mathematics. There would be no heroic patch, no quick tow, no simple correction. The question ceased to be how to save the ship, and became how to use the time left aboard her. That is a terrible kind of knowledge to hold while everyone around you still expects routine to continue. And routine did continue for a while, at least on the surface. Orders had to be issued calmly, lifeboats had to be uncovered and prepared, passengers had to be roused, some had to be persuaded to dress, others had to be persuaded to leave the warmth inside at all. Crew members moved through corridors telling people to put on life jackets. There is something almost domestic about that instruction, something absurdly mild considering the stakes. Put on your life jacket, come up on deck, bring a blanket if you need one. Nothing in that language sounds like the edge of mass death. It sounds like caution, inconvenience, perhaps a drill that management has made tediously real at the worst possible hour. The social world of the ship also mattered, and not for flattering reasons. Titanic was organised by class, and class does not dissolve the instant danger appears. It lingers in architecture, access, assumptions, and the speed at which information travels. Some passengers were closer to open decks and better placed to act quickly. Others were deeper in the ship, farther from fresh air, farther from decision makers, farther from the calm authority that might have told them to move without delay. Even in emergency, people tend to travel along the track society has already laid for them. A grand staircase is easy to remember. A narrow passage with urgency in it is not. Still, on deck, the mood was uncertain rather than openly frantic. This is one of the key things people often miss. For a surprising amount of time, Titanic did not look like she was seconds from vanishing. She was not yet standing up out of the sea like the famous image fixed in popular culture. She was a ship with a slight and then growing list, a ship colder than before, a ship asking people to step into small boats, while the larger, warmer, better lit thing behind them still seemed too substantial to abandon. Imagine being told to leave a floating hotel for a dark wooden lifeboat hanging over black water. Even now, with the full story known, you can feel the resistance. It goes against instinct. The ship looks safe. The boat looks temporary and thin. Your room is below with your things in it. Your husband says it is probably precautionary. A steward sounds polite, not alarmed. The band, for heaven's sake, is still playing. Human beings do not leap eagerly from apparent security into obvious discomfort without a very convincing reason. As the lifeboats began to lower, this gap between appearance and reality shaped everything. Some boats left with empty seats because passengers were reluctant, others because procedures were imperfect, others because no one fully grasped in those first efforts that every place would matter. It is one of those bitter details history never lets us set down gently. There was room for a time, and still there was hesitation, because the mind takes time to catch up to the truth the body has not yet fully seen. By the time the ship's condition became undeniable, the deck angle steeper, the forward part lower, the cold more intrusive, the order less stable, options had already narrowed. And that is where tonight's journey is headed. Not to the simplified version, not merely to the legend of a great liner going down under a field of stars. We are going to stay close to the people on board and to the sequence of minutes as they changed from manageable to impossible. We will look at how the ship behaved physically in those last stages, what people likely saw and felt, why some decisions made sense in the moment even when they seem baffling now, and how the final minutes became so confused, so fractured, and so haunting in memory. Because when Titanic truly entered her last stretch, the world on deck did not transform into one single dramatic tableau. It broke into many small human scenes happening at once. A mother fastening a life jacket with stiff fingers, A man stepping back from the rail because he still thinks there will be another boat. A crewman shouting to be heard above the mechanical sounds of a ship beginning to strain. Someone looking up at the stars because they are easier to look at than the water. Someone else returning below, incredibly, to fetch a coat, a purse, a book, one last proof that ordinary life might resume if only one behaves properly enough. It is always striking how long people keep trying to be normal. Soon the slope would become harder to ignore. Soon the cold would stop feeling like weather and start feeling like threat. Soon the deck itself would begin to tell the truth more clearly than any officer could soften with his voice. And once that happened, the ship's final minutes would no longer belong to order in the same way. They would belong to urgency, to misjudgment, to bravery, to fear, to frozen hands and narrowing choices and the awful arithmetic of too few boats, too little time, and a sea waiting just beyond the rails. So let us stay with the night a little longer before that point arrives. Let us remain on that deck while the lights are still burning, while the music still drifts in patches through the cold air, while the great ship has not yet shown all of her wound. Because the end did not come down all at once. It approached step by step, minute by minute, through the slow failure of confidence, the slow tilt of steel, and the first unmistakable signs that Titanic, for all her size and splendour, was no longer carrying her passengers safely across the Atlantic at all, but steadily, relentlessly, into the final stretch of her own story. By the time Titanic left Southampton in April of 1912, she was already carrying something larger than her passengers, her luggage, or her mail. She was carrying expectation. Not the ordinary kind people place on a ship to reach New York on schedule, but something heavier and more flattering. She had been presented to the world as proof that modern industry could do almost anything if enough steel, money, engineering and confidence were put in the same place. People did not simply board Titanic to travel. Many boarded her to experience the newest and most impressive example of what the age believed it could build. It is easy to say now that this confidence was misplaced, and of course it was, but it was not irrational in the way hindsight likes to pretend. Titanic really was enormous. She really was advanced by the standards of her time. She really did contain comforts and systems that made older ships seem cramped and old-fashioned. Even people who had never seen her in person knew her name. Newspapers wrote about her size, her luxury, her stability, her engines, her fittings. The famous grand staircase, the electric lifts, the dining rooms, the Turkish baths, the heated swimming pool, the squash court, and all the details meant to suggest that sea travel no longer needed to feel like sea travel in the old sense. The message was clear enough. You were not merely crossing the Atlantic, you were doing it inside a floating version of modern success. That matters because belief changes behaviour. A person stepping onto a little coastal vessel watches every movement, notices every sound, and keeps a quiet awareness of risk near the front of the mind. A person entering a vast ocean liner, greeted by polished wood, bright lighting, uniformed staff, and an atmosphere closer to a fashionable hotel than a practical ship, relaxes in a different way. The senses are persuaded. The body begins to trust the environment. One starts to think not in terms of danger, but in terms of routine. Where is the dining room? When is tea? Is the cabin warm enough? How crowded will the promenade be after dinner? Even a mildly inconvenient wobble becomes a matter for annoyance rather than alarm. Luxury does that. It smooths the edge off caution. Titanic had been built in Belfast by Harland and Wolff, and she was the largest moving object many people of the time had ever seen. That phrase is used often, but it is worth pausing on because size, when it passes a certain point, stops being a fact and starts becoming an emotion. A ship of modest dimensions still registers as transport. Titanic, to many eyes, registered as an environment. She had the scale of a structure rather than a vessel. People did not look at her and think of small boats fighting weather. They thought of power, order, and a future in which distance itself had been brought under control, Her owners, the White Star Line, understood the value of this image very well. They did not market Titanic as the fastest ship on the Atlantic because she was not built to chase speed records. Instead, she represented size, steadiness, and comfort. There was a particular confidence in that strategy. Fast ships impressed people, but grand ships reassured them. They suggested that the crossing could be civilized, that roughness and risk could be reduced to manageable background details, while people enjoyed heavy carpets, well-prepared meals, and respectable surroundings. The Atlantic, in this view, was not abolished, but it was being domesticated. One can almost hear the Edwardian sails pitch beneath it all. Yes, there is an ocean out there, but do look at these dining chairs. And to be fair, the confidence was supported by real achievements. Titanic's construction was a remarkable feat. Her hull, her engines, her boilers, her electrical systems, her communications equipment, and the sheer coordination needed to build and operate her were all products of a world that had become very proud of mechanical competence. This was the age of expanding rail networks, steel bridges, urban lighting, industrial standardization, and systems that appeared to show that human beings were finally learning to organize complexity at a grand scale. Titanic was one of the brightest symbols of that feeling. She did not arrive in a vacuum. She arrived in a culture already inclined to admire large engineered things, and to believe that each new triumph pushed old dangers a little farther back. That belief touched every class of passenger in different ways. For the wealthy, Titanic offered luxury without apology. First-class accommodation on board was designed not merely to serve, but to impress. There were elegant staterooms, private promenades, à la carte dining, richly decorated lounges, and details meant to flatter the idea that one could travel across an ocean without surrendering the habits of fine living. It is hard to overstate how important presentation was here. Wealthy passengers did not want to feel they were enduring the Atlantic. They wanted to feel they were moving through it on terms largely set by themselves. Titanic provided exactly that illusion. The sea was outside. Civilization remained inside. For second-class passengers, Titanic represented something different, but no less powerful. She offered respectability on a level many had not expected at sea. Second-class accommodation on Titanic was said to be comparable in some respects to first class on older ships, and that was no small thing. It meant that professional people, families of means, clergy, teachers, merchants, and others who were not at the absolute top of society could take part in the modern age's new comfort without feeling relegated to the margins. They too were invited into the idea that travel had become orderly, safe, and well managed. Then there was third class, where the story becomes more complicated. Conditions there were still far from equal to those above, and no amount of polished company language changes that. Yet even many third-class passengers experienced Titanic as an improvement over what had come before. For migrants heading toward new lives, the ship represented movement, possibility, and a level of accommodation that, while restricted, was better than the cramped and unhealthy arrangements found on many earlier vessels. Separate dining areas, better ventilation, and cleaner surroundings mattered. This was still a rigidly divided ship, but even its lowest class carried a sense that modernity was doing something practical, not merely decorative. So across the ship, though in different ways and to different degrees, people were invited to trust the system around them. That trust was strengthened by ritual. Once Titanic was underway, life aboard settled quickly into patterns. Meals were served, deck chairs were used, conversations formed and reformed, children explored, letters were written, card games were played, people dressed for dinner, stewards knocked when needed. The great machine beneath it all did its work with such steadiness that the ship's movement itself became part of the furniture of experience. The engines were not always consciously noticed. That is one of the marks of successful engineering. When a system is working well, people stop paying attention to it and begin paying attention to themselves. And yet the ship's reputation was not built only on luxury and size. It was also tied to the persistent and famous notion that Titanic was in some sense unsinkable. Here, a little care is needed, because later retellings have often flattened the issue into something too neat. It is not quite accurate to say that every responsible person openly declared Titanic absolutely incapable of sinking in any imaginable condition. Reality was more slippery, which is often how dangerous myths spread. The ship was widely described as exceptionally safe. Her watertight compartments and remotely operated watertight doors were praised. The press echoed and amplified these claims. The public absorbed them. Soon the distinction between designed with advanced safety features and practically unsinkable grew thin enough to disappear in conversation. That is how myths usually work. They do not need to be formally announced from a balcony. They only need to be repeated often enough, in flattering enough language that people begin to treat them like common sense. Titanic's safety was discussed in a way that encouraged overconfidence. The ship did have compartmentalization. She did have safety design elements that were real and important, but those facts were simplified into a comforting public story. And comforting public stories are much easier to carry around than engineering limits. There's also something worth saying about the emotional atmosphere of the early 20th century. This was a period that believed in progress with unusual confidence. There had been disasters before, certainly, and plenty of them. But there was a growing feeling among industrial societies that technical problems could be solved one by one, and that large institutions could manage risk better than in the past. Disease could be studied, cities could be electrified, bridges could span impossible distances, messages could travel by wireless across open water, and giant ships could cross oceans on schedule while people ate multi-course dinners under electric light. All of that was real. The mistake was not in noticing progress. The mistake was in allowing progress to create a mood of immunity. Titanic, more than many objects of her day, embodied that mood. She seemed to say that nature had not vanished, but had at least become negotiable. The Atlantic was still cold, still dark, still capable of violence, yet here was a vessel so large, so organised, so carefully run, that one could believe danger had been reduced to an old-fashioned concern, something sailors might still mutter about while respectable passengers discussed the menu. This is one reason the story has remained so gripping. Titanic did not only sink a ship, it punctured a very flattering idea about how secure modern people had become. Still, on board during the voyage, none of that would have felt like philosophy. It would have felt like comfort. A first-class passenger might have noticed the high quality of the linen, the smooth service, the quiet competence of the crew, and the beauty of the public rooms. A second-class passenger might have felt pleasantly surprised by the spaciousness and order. A third-class family might have focused on the clean bunks, the sense of movement toward a new life, and the simple relief of being aboard a ship that looked solid, organised, and well supervised. None of these people needed to sit around declaring the triumph of industrial civilization. They were living inside the argument already. The physical design of the ship also helped produce emotional calm. Titanic was broad and relatively stable for a vessel of her kind. That meant many passengers experienced less dramatic motion than they might have expected. Again, this encouraged trust. A violently rolling ship reminds everyone that the sea remains in charge. A steady one creates the sense that all is proceeding as intended. Passengers could walk, dine and sleep without constant bodily reminders of exposure. Even the sounds of the ship, once familiar, became reassuring. The low vibration of engines, the faint hum of operation, the routine footsteps in passageways. All these things supported the impression of a controlled world. There was also crew professionalism, which should not be dismissed. The men and women serving aboard Titanic were not decorative additions to the vessel's image. They were part of what made her feel dependable. Stewards, engineers, firemen, officers, cooks, wireless operators, and many others kept the system running. Their work was specialised, disciplined, and mostly hidden from passengers until needed. A well-run ship often feels safe precisely because much of the labour that protects comfort remains out of sight. Bedding appears fresh, Meals arrive hot, corridors stay orderly, the timetable holds, and passengers are free to imagine that such ease is natural rather than maintained by continuous effort. This kind of managed calm creates an interesting effect. The more successfully a system works, the less prepared its users are to imagine it failing. That is not stupidity, it is habit. When every visible sign suggests competence, people build their expectations accordingly. A man reading in the smoking room does not think about watertight bulkheads. A child looking over the rail does not think about steel plates or rivets. A woman writing a letter in her cabin does not think that below her feet, deep in the ship, there are spaces where a small change in water level could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. Human attention naturally narrows toward what feels relevant. Titanic's comfort narrowed it very effectively. Even the ship's social form reinforced trust. Formal dinner dress, assigned places, polite service, scheduled meals, posted notices, and visible hierarchy all send the same basic signal. The world is in order. There are rules. There are people in charge. Things happen properly here. Once that feeling settles in, it becomes psychologically difficult to believe that one may soon be called to scramble, improvise, or choose between impossible options. Emergency feels like something that belongs on rougher ships, poorer ships, older ships, or ships commanded by fools. Not here. Not in these surroundings. Not with these officers. Not with these fittings. Not while the silver still shines. And that, perhaps, is the most important part of all. Titanic did not need to be literally believed invincible by every single person in order to create dangerous confidence. She only needed to feel too grand to fail. That is a different thing, and in some ways more powerful. People may admit in theory that any ship can sink, but theory does not always guide the emotions. In practice, Titanic seemed like the kind of ship for which ordinary limits had been pushed back. She was too well built, too large, too famous, too expensive, too thoroughly admired. Surely if there were risks, they had already been accounted for by men with diagrams, calculations, uniforms, and very serious expressions. Surely that was what all this civilization was for. There was, however, a weakness hidden inside this confidence, and it had less to do with steel than with tempo. When people trust a system deeply, they react more slowly to signs that it is failing. They look for explanations that preserve normality. A strange sound becomes nothing. A delay becomes routine. An instruction to put on extra clothing feels precautionary rather than urgent. On a smaller, rougher, less celebrated vessel, the same signs might have caused faster alarm. On Titanic, grandeur itself would become part of the delay. In the early days of the voyage, there was little to disturb this mood. The ship moved steadily westward. Passengers enjoyed the spaces provided to them. The Atlantic seemed manageable enough. The machinery continued its patient labour. Even class tensions, while real and built into the ship's design, existed within a larger framework that still felt stable. The wealthy expected service. The respectable middle ranks expected order. The poorer passengers expected movement and supervision. Everyone, in some form, expected the ship to continue being what it had promised to be. That expectation also helps explain why later recollections from survivors often dwell on details that seem almost too ordinary. A meal, a conversation, a walk on deck, someone commenting on the cold, someone noticing how still the sea looked. In memory, those details become important because they show how complete the illusion of normality remained. No one stands in the middle of a routine evening thinking, this will later be described in every history of the disaster. They simply go about being alive, surrounded by systems that appear strong enough to carry them forward without incident. By the evening of April 14th, Titanic still wore that look of confidence. She was making good speed. The passengers, for the most part, were occupied with the business of a voyage that had not yet broken character. Dinner had been served, rooms were warm, public spaces were active, some people retired early, others lingered, The deck air had grown colder, and some who stepped outside noticed it clearly enough, but cold in the North Atlantic was not in itself a revelation. The ship remained what she had been since departure, a bright, structured world moving through darkness with every sign of command still intact. Below that polished surface, of course, the ship was also a machine driven by fuel, boilers, engines, schedules and decisions made by officers and crew who understood that reputation must be matched by performance. A liner like Titanic was not sent into service merely to look impressive while drifting politely from one continent to another. She was expected to make passage efficiently. She was expected to maintain standards. She was expected to arrive. None of this meant recklessness in some cartoon sense, but it did mean that confidence, once built into a ship's public image and daily operation, travelled with her in more than one form. That evening, wireless messages were moving across the sea as ships exchanged reports, including warnings about ice in the North Atlantic. This was not a ghost story, or some mysterious omen wrapped in moonlight. It was information passed in the practical language of maritime traffic. Ice had been sighted. Conditions were being reported. Ships did what ships did, and shared what they knew. Somewhere inside Titanic's ordered, brightly lit world, those messages entered the system. They did not arrive as thunder. They arrived as part of the business of running a modern liner. Just another reminder that even the grandest ship on the ocean still travelled through a place that did not care about her wallpaper, her reputation, or the confidence she inspired in everyone on board. As the evening of April 14th settled over the Atlantic, Titanic still looked like a place where nothing especially dramatic was likely to happen. The dining rooms had done their work. The corridors had grown quieter. Doors had closed softly. Shoes had been removed. The public rooms were less animated than earlier in the day, though not empty. Some passengers were still reading, talking, smoking, writing letters, or enjoying the last stretch of a well-run evening. Others had already gone to bed with the kind of confidence people only have when they believe the world around them is doing exactly what it was built to do. That confidence matters here, because the warnings that came that day did not arrive in a form designed to frighten ordinary people. They arrived as messages, practical, clipped, professional, and easy to file mentally under the category of routine maritime business. There had been reports of ice in the North Atlantic. Other ships had seen it. Positions had been sent. Cautions had been passed along. This was not the language of prophecy. No one was saying, "You're moving toward the single most famous collision in modern history." No one was stamping documents with a neat red mark that read disaster pending. It was just traffic in a sense. Ships talking to ships, information moving across cold air by wireless, a modern network doing what it was meant to do. That is one of the strange things about the Titanic story. We often imagine the warning stage as if fate had stood squarely in front of the ship waving both arms. In reality, the danger moved through ordinary channels. Men at wireless sets tapped out reports. Officers received messages. Conditions were known in a general way. Ice in April in the North Atlantic was not a fairy tale, it was a hazard of the route. The difficulty was not that nobody had ever heard of icebergs. The difficulty was that known danger and felt danger are not the same thing. A thing can be fully real and still fail to produce the emotional effect required to change behaviour in time. Earlier that day, Titanic had received several ice warnings from other ships. These reports gave positions of ice, field ice, and large bergs. Some were passed to the bridge, some were discussed, some entered the general stream of operational awareness. It would be satisfying, perhaps, if history offered a single clear moment when one message should have stopped the ship at once, and everything after that could be blamed on one foolish decision. Real life is usually more untidy. There were multiple signals, received in a busy environment, interpreted by men who were not reading them from the comfort of hindsight. They were running a liner on a schedule, in waters where ice was a recognised but not extraordinary concern, aboard a ship widely regarded as strong, modern and well-handled. This is not the same as saying the warnings were unimportant. They were important, very important, but importance does not always produce urgency. That depends on context, tone, workload, assumptions, and the habits of the people receiving the information. A captain on a bridge at sea lives within a constant stream of facts, corrections, estimates, reports, and decisions. Wind, temperature, position, course, traffic, timing, weather, visibility, machinery, routine operation, all of it matters. A warning does not walk into that room alone and demand to be treated like a scene in a play. It arrives among other things and must compete with a system already in motion. And Titanic was very much in motion, not only physically but socially. The ship had her own rhythm by then. Meals had been served, the machinery was running steadily, the voyage had settled into a pattern that encouraged confidence. A few cold gusts on deck did not overturn that feeling. Even the warnings themselves, had passengers heard them plainly, might not have sounded like reason to panic. Ice ahead does not necessarily mean collision. It may mean caution. It may mean a slight change in handling. It may mean nothing visible at all to those on board. We tend to forget how much modern minds have been trained by later retellings. To us, ice warning in the Titanic story glows with dreadful certainty. To those living inside the evening, it was still one hazard among several that professional seamen were expected to manage. There is also the wireless room to consider, because the romance of early radio often hides the practical messiness of it. Titanic's wireless operators were not sitting in a quiet temple of prophecy, waiting only for life-saving messages to descend from above. They were working men with equipment, interruptions, traffic, priorities, and a commercial function. Wireless on great liners did serve navigational safety, but it also handled passenger messages. Private telegrams mattered. Operational transmissions mattered. Range, signal strength, backlog, and the sheer busyness of communication all mattered. It was not a clean little modern dashboard with colour-coded alerts. It was active, human, and imperfect. One of the operators, Jack Phillips, had been especially busy dealing with a backlog after equipment trouble earlier in the voyage. That detail tends to sit quietly in the story, but it matters more than it first appears to. Fatigue and backlog make people narrower in focus. When you're trying to clear a line of work, other incoming traffic can begin to feel like interruption rather than illumination. That does not make anyone a villain. It makes them tired and human. On a ship as large and socially active as Titanic, passenger telegrams were not decorative extras. They were part of the ship's function, part of what modern luxury at sea included. So while the world later wanted every warning treated with sacred drama, the men in the wireless room were also dealing with the practical business of messages that paying passengers expected to be sent. A particularly striking moment came late in the evening when the nearby steamship Californian sent a message that it had stopped for the night because of ice. That report should catch the ear even now because it sounds so plain. Not merely ice sighted somewhere in the broad Atlantic, but a ship halted by conditions. Yet the way the moment unfolded was strangely ordinary. Californian's operator transmitted the warning while Titanic's operator was busy sending passenger traffic to Cape Race, the station in Newfoundland. The signal from Californian was strong because the ships were relatively close, and it came through loudly in Phillips's headphones. Tired, focused, and perhaps irritated at the interruption, he reportedly answered with the now famous sharpness that has echoed through the story ever since, essentially telling the other operator to keep out because he was working another station. It is one of those painful little scenes history preserves because it compresses so much of the disaster's character into a few human seconds. No melodrama, no villain stroking a moustache while ignoring doom. Just a tired radio operator trying to do his job, annoyed by interference, brushing off a nearby warning in a tone that must have seemed forgettable at the time. It is almost unbearably ordinary. That is why it lingers. Many great disasters contain a moment when a crucial fact arrives in the shape of an inconvenience. Now, one should be careful here not to load every ounce of blame onto one exchange. The system around the warning was larger than one weary man at a key. Some ice information had reached the bridge already from earlier messages. Officers knew there was ice in the region. Temperatures had dropped. Conditions were being watched. The problem was not total ignorance. It was a pattern of under-concentrated danger. The warnings formed a field of concern without quite becoming the one commanding fact that restructured the whole night. The atmosphere on deck that evening added another layer to this. It was cold, very cold, but calm. And calm at sea can be deceptive. People who know the ocean sometimes distrust a stillness that others find comforting. On the night Titanic struck the iceberg, the sea was unusually flat. There was little wind. The surface lacked the lively texture that waves normally provide. Under other conditions, even in darkness, water breaking around the base of an iceberg might have made it easier to detect. White spray, contrast, movement, a visible edge against the blackness. On this night the ocean was smoother, darker, and less inclined to reveal what stood ahead. The stars were bright, the air clear, and yet the visual world in front of the ship was not generous. That is one of the cruel ironies of the final hours. Many things seemed favourable. The weather was not stormy. Visibility in a general sense was decent. There was no fog closing in, no shrieking gale, no waves crashing over the bow. To an untrained eye, and even to some trained ones, the night may have looked almost ideal, quiet, crisp, uneventful. But a quiet night can hide danger just as effectively as a wild one, only with better manners. By then, most of the passengers knew nothing of this in any meaningful sense. They were not part of the warning system. They were living inside the sleeping world that gives this part of the story its peculiar mood. Children had been tucked in. Lamps glowed behind curtains. The ship moved forward with that deep, steady assurance only a large vessel can produce. Somewhere below, engines and boilers continued their labour. Somewhere above, officers watched the night. Somewhere else, messages about ice had already crossed the ship and settled into memory, paperwork, or brief conversation. Yet across the passenger decks, life still felt stitched together by routine. There is something almost domestic in imagining it. A woman setting aside a hairbrush, a man finishing a cigar in the smoking room and deciding whether to have one last word with an acquaintance before turning in. Someone folding a coat more carefully than necessary because travel always makes people act a little tidier than usual. A steward moving quietly along a corridor. A shoe placed beside a bed. A light switched off. Outside, in that immense dark, there were bergs and field ice. Inside, there were blankets and warm cabins. History often hinges on this kind of contrast. The world that knows and the world that sleeps can exist only a few steel plates apart. Captain Edward Smith, Titanic's commander, has long stood under the glare of judgment here, and naturally so. The captain is the symbolic centre of authority aboard a ship, yet even his decisions must be understood within the habits of his time. He was not navigating some fragile experimental craft with no precedent behind it. He was commanding a great liner in an age when experienced captains did not automatically stop dead because ice had been reported in the wider region. Course adjustments, vigilance, practical handling, these were standard responses. The question later became whether Titanic should have slowed more significantly, altered course more decisively, or treated the specific combination of warnings and conditions as sufficient reason for greater caution. Those are fair questions. They have been asked for more than a century. What is striking, though, is how much of that debate rests on the tension between a world that still believed itself in control and a sea that was about to show otherwise. Speed, too, enters the story here, and always with a sort of moral accusation attached to it. Titanic was not racing for a blue ribbon in the way some people imagine, and she was not at her absolute maximum speed, but she was moving quickly. The ship was maintaining a strong pace through waters known to contain ice. That fact sits heavily in every retelling because it sounds, and in some ways was, a dangerous confidence. Yet to understand why it happened, one has to remember the culture of liner operation and the expectations built around these ships. Great ocean liners were meant to move. They were scheduled, observed, and judged on performance as well as comfort. A powerful new ship under experienced command did not lightly turn herself into a drifting monument at the first sign of inconvenience. Again, that does not excuse the decision. It explains the climate of judgment in which the decision felt reasonable enough to continue. There is a difference, and it matters. Most disastrous choices do not appear in the moment as cartoonishly foolish. They appear manageable. They appear consistent with prior success. They feel like extensions of confidence rather than acts of madness. Meanwhile, down in the wireless room, messages kept moving. One of the most important ice warnings of the day came from the steamship Masaba, which reported a significant area of ice and bergs ahead on the route. The message was received by Titanic, but it did not reach the bridge in the way later generations wish it had. That detail is one of the coldest in the whole chain of events, because it shows how modern systems can fail not by collapse, but by incomplete transfer. The information existed, it travelled, it arrived, but it did not fully become action at the level that mattered most. The warning sat in the gap between possession and consequence. There is a lesson there so broad, it almost feels unfair to say aloud. Human beings love information, but information alone does not save them. It must be interpreted, elevated, trusted, prioritised, and turned into conduct. Otherwise, it remains a fact lying politely on the table while events continue toward it. Titanic had warning, but warning is only the first half of prevention. Around this time, the lookouts in the crow's nest were peering into the dark without binoculars, a point much discussed ever since. The absence of binoculars has taken on a near mythic quality, as though a single pair of lenses might have rewritten the Atlantic. Perhaps they would have helped. Perhaps not enough. The conditions were difficult in their own way. A moonless night, a calm sea, a black horizon, bitter cold, and a berg not eager to announce itself. What matters more than the missing binoculars is the general shape of the situation. Titanic was moving into an area where ice had been reported, under conditions that made spotting it harder, while much of the ship, from cabins to saloons, remained inside the ordinary hush of a voyage late at night, and that hush is what gives this stage of the story its uneasy character. Nothing had yet happened in the way people later recognise as happening. There was no impact, no rush to lifeboats, no list, no terrible angle to the deck, no undeniable proof. There was only a sleeping ship under a bright field of stars crossing cold water with messages of caution already somewhere in her system. In many disasters, there is a final period in which the chance to avoid the worst outcome still exists, but it does not look dramatic enough to stir the necessary change. This was Titanic's version of that period. Passengers who had chosen to remain awake may have stepped briefly onto deck and noticed how sharp the air felt. Some may have admired the stars. Some likely commented on the cold and went back inside quickly, preferring the ship's warm interiors. That movement itself says something. Titanic was not making people feel exposed. She was giving them options. Too cold outside? There is a lounge. Want quiet? There is a cabin. Hungry? Food exists. Bored? Conversation is nearby. The ship kept offering the shelter of normal life, and people accepted it because why would they not? Even on the bridge, where the responsibilities were most severe, the night was not a scene of dramatic alarm. Orders were given, watches were maintained, the ship held her way. Men did what trained men do when nothing visibly extraordinary has yet occurred. The iceberg was not in sight. The hull was intact. The lights were steady. The decks remained level. A warning system without a visible object often feels theoretical right up until theory becomes steel, and ice meeting in the dark. It is also worth noticing how sleep changes a crisis before it has even begun. A ship full of sleeping people is slower to transform. Those on watch may be alert, but most of the human mass aboard is at rest, undressed, disoriented by the hour, separated from events by walls, doors, and dreams. Even if danger emerges, it must travel through layers of disbelief and delay simply because so many people are not presently engaged with the world outside their cabin. That sleeping world makes the coming minutes more tragic, because once the collision happened, time would already be reduced, and a large part of the ship would need to be awakened into understanding from a state of warmth and trust. So the night carried on, almost offensively calm. The temperature dropped further. The sea remained flat. The ship moved forward. Somewhere in the broad, dark ahead, the iceberg was waiting in complete indifference to schedules, class divisions, polished woodwork, and human confidence. On board, the warnings had not vanished, but neither had they become the ruling fact of the evening. They hovered in the background, important but not decisive, known but not fully felt. That is often how danger approaches. Not with a trumpet, but with paperwork and silence. The people aboard Titanic were not fools asleep at the wheel of history. They were something more ordinary and therefore more recognisable. They were professionals trusting systems, passengers trusting appearances, and a whole floating society trusting that one more night at sea would pass as the previous ones had. Their world was lit, organised, and warm. The wider world beyond it was freezing, black, and patient. The gap between those two worlds was narrowing by the minute, though almost no one on board could have sensed how little time remained before caution would stop being a message and become a shape in the darkness directly ahead of them. By late evening on April 14th, the men stationed high above the deck in Titanic's crow's nest had settled into the kind of concentration that is both intense and repetitive. Lookout duty at night was not dramatic in the way films like to present it. It was long stretches of peering into darkness, letting the eyes adjust, scanning ahead, scanning again, feeling cold work its way into the body, and trying to remain alert when the scene in front of you changed very little from minute to minute. There was no cheerful comfort up there, no polished wood, no warm lamps, no company of conversation. There was only the air, the black horizon, the ship's forward motion, and the responsibility of seeing what needed to be seen before it was too late. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee were the two lookouts on duty that night. They were experienced enough to understand that the conditions ahead were not as easy as they might have seemed to a passenger stepping outside for 10 seconds and admiring the stars. The air was clear, yes. The sky was bright with stars, yes. But the sea was unusually calm. That mattered. With no wind to raise a line of surf around the base of floating ice, the ocean gave fewer visual clues. On many nights, waves breaking round an iceberg might have made it stand out more clearly, offering a pale edge or movement against the dark. On this night, the water lay flatter, darker, and less willing to help. This is one of those details that can sound minor until you imagine the job properly. To detect a dark mass ahead on a moonless night, against a background that is mostly darkness already, from the front of a large moving ship, without modern radar, is not the same as spotting a white object under a harbour lamp. The iceberg did not arrive with a spotlight on it. It was simply there, somewhere ahead, waiting to become visible at the worst possible distance. Down below, Titanic pushed onward at a strong pace. The bridge officers maintained the watch. The engines continued their deep and disciplined labour. Most passengers remained inside the calm world of the ship, only dimly aware, if at all, that the men above and ahead were staring into a difficult night, while the vessel moved through water where ice had already been reported. The important thing to remember is that no one on board yet had the emotional posture of emergency. Not the passengers, of course, and not even the officers in the sense later generations might expect. There was vigilance, certainly, but not panic. There was concern, perhaps, but not a deck-wide sense that catastrophe was moments away. Titanic still looked like Titanic, steady, bright, orderly. Her great bulk still suggested control. Then, at around 11:40 p.m. ship's time, the darkness ahead changed shape. Fleet later described seeing a dark object, a kind of black mass rising ahead in the ship's path. That description is important because people often imagine a glowing white mountain suddenly blazing into view. On that night, it did not present itself so generously. It was more like a shape where no shape should have been, an interruption in the pattern of darkness, a mass looming ahead with not nearly enough room left for comfort. It appeared not as scenery, but as problem. One can picture the instant in a very human way. The eye catches something uncertain at first, a patch too solid, a shadow that does not move like shadow. Then the mind catches up a split second later, and the uncertainty becomes recognition. Iceberg. Fleet reacted the way a lookout was trained to react. He struck the bell 3 times, the signal for an object ahead. Then he reached for the telephone connecting the crow's nest to the bridge. There is a kind of compressed terror in that sequence, not because it was theatrical, but because it was procedural. The bell, the phone, a report delivered in the plain language of duty. No grand speech, no raised music. Just a man in the cold saying, in effect, something is ahead and it is directly in our way. "Is there anyone there?" he called down to the bridge when the line connected. "Yes," came the reply, "iceberg right ahead." Those words have become famous because they feel like the point where the entire story tightens. Everything before them is approach, everything after them is reaction. Yet even here, it is worth resisting the temptation to imagine perfect clarity descending on everyone at once. On the bridge, the men now had a report of immediate danger, but reports do not move ships by themselves. They have to be translated into orders, and orders have to fight the simple physical fact that a very large ship does not turn like a carriage avoiding a puddle. First Officer William Murdoch was in charge on the bridge at that moment. What followed happened quickly, but not magically. He gave the order to alter course, traditionally described as hard a starboard, which under the steering language of the time would swing the ship's bow to port, or left. He also ordered the engine stopped. Accounts later varied on whether full astern was ordered at once, or how exactly the engine sequence played out in the seconds available. Maritime historians have spent years on those details, and with good reason, because those few decisions have been examined more closely than most moments in naval history. But whatever the exact combination of orders in those immediate seconds, the essential truth is not in doubt. The bridge reacted. The helm was put over. The attempt was made to turn the ship away. And Titanic did begin to answer. That is one of the more frustrating and haunting elements of the whole event. The ship was not a passive block of steel mindlessly charging to its fate. She started to swing. The bow began to move. There was action, effort, human skill under pressure. But the available distance was terribly short and the ship was terribly large. This is where scale becomes cruel. Earlier in the voyage, Titanic's size had produced admiration and calm. In this moment, the same size worked against her. Large ships carry momentum in a grand and stubborn way. When they are moving fast, they need space to change their minds. The officers on the bridge had seconds. Titanic required more. From the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee would have watched that dark mass swelling larger, the boom moving, the ship answering, but perhaps not enough, not soon enough. The iceberg itself, meanwhile, was not some neat pointed wedge placed for dramatic convenience. These bergs were irregular, with underwater bulk far greater than what showed above the surface. Their visible shape could be deceptive. Their edges might slope or jut. Their true size was hidden partly by darkness and mostly by the sea that carried them. To the men staring forward, what mattered was immediate. It was ahead. The ship was nearly upon it. What must those seconds have felt like? Too brief for proper thought, long enough for certainty. That is the peculiar misery of a near collision. There is just enough time to understand, not enough time to fix. On the bridge, all eyes would have been forward. Officers, quartermaster, men at stations, each suddenly drawn into the same narrowing reality. The ship's nose was moving away, but the enormous length behind it still had to clear. That is another thing people often miss when imagining the event. It was not enough for the bow simply to avoid a head-on strike. The hull had to pass safely along the iceberg's side. Turning late could save the front and doom the flank. That seems to be exactly what happened. Titanic likely missed the berg with her bow by a relatively small margin, only for the starboard side below the waterline and along sections of the hull to brush or scrape against the ice. It was not, in all likelihood, a cinematic smashing impact of the kind many people instinctively picture. It was something in some ways worse, a glancing blow, prolonged enough and hard enough to damage the hull across multiple forward compartments. But before that damage was understood, there was the actual sensory moment of contact, and this too deserves slowing down because it helps explain why so many passengers did not immediately grasp the seriousness of what had occurred. Imagine yourself inside Titanic at that instant. You are not on the bridge, you're not in the crow's nest, you are in a warm cabin, perhaps nearly asleep or already asleep, or you are in a public room finishing a conversation, or you are a steward putting something in order. The collision, when it came, was not a huge explosive crash that threw every person sideways and shattered the illusion of security in a single stroke. Many survivors later described it as a jar, a shudder, a trembling sensation, a scraping, or a kind of long, subdued vibration. Some noticed almost nothing. Others felt enough to pause and wonder. A few, depending on where they were, recognised more clearly that something unusual had happened. That discrepancy in experience began right here, in the moment the iceberg appeared and the ship tried to evade it. Because the reaction almost worked, or at least partly worked, the collision did not present itself in the loudest form possible. There was no direct head-on stop, no catastrophic crunch in the centre of the ship's public consciousness. Instead, there was a less obvious injury, spread out technical, hidden below the waterline, much easier to underestimate in its first seconds. From the deck, some people may have heard or felt a faint grinding along the starboard side. Small pieces of ice may even have fallen onto sections of the forward well deck, strange pale evidence that the ship had brushed something frozen in the dark. To a curious passenger, that could almost have seemed interesting rather than terrifying, like an awkward encounter rather than a mortal wound. That is the difficulty with certain disasters. Their visible signs are too modest for the scale of what has actually gone wrong. Up on the bridge, however, modesty was not the feeling. The officers knew they had come dangerously close, and they knew contact had been made. The question was immediate and practical. How bad was it? This is where the mood shifts from sudden sight to urgent uncertainty. The moment the iceberg appeared was brief. The moment after it was murkier and in some ways more dangerous because people had to judge damage before the ship herself began showing it clearly. Murdoch and the others were now in the position all leaders dread. A serious event has occurred, but its consequences are not yet visible enough to the wider body of people who will soon need direction. That gap between damage and evidence creates some of the most difficult minutes in any crisis. Captain Edward Smith, who had likely retired for the evening but remained available, was summoned to the bridge quickly after the collision. One imagines him arriving into an atmosphere that was controlled but sharpened. Reports would have been given, the basic facts stated. Iceberg sighted, helm over, contact made, engines stopped. Then comes the next step that sounds simple in summary and feels terrible in reality. Inspection. Someone must go below and find out whether the ship has been breached, and if so, where and how badly. Meanwhile, in the ship's lower regions, where passengers rarely went and thought about even less, men were already encountering the answer in a more physical form. The boiler rooms and mailroom were among the spaces soon affected. Water does not enter politely. Once the hull opens enough for the sea to force itself in, the change is immediate, cold, and unmistakable to those nearest it. This was the first place where Titanic's grand self-image failed outright. Not in the drawing rooms, not at the grand staircase, not under the electric chandeliers, but deep below, among steel, rivets, labour, and machinery, where the sea came in and made all public confidence irrelevant. The timing here is important. While the lookout sighting and the bridge reaction happened within moments, the ship's social understanding lagged behind. Passengers were still catching up. Many had not yet even risen from bed. A few may have opened cabin doors and looked into corridors. Some stewards may have been asked whether there had been an accident. In the first-class areas especially, where the environment remained warm and intact, the temptation to dismiss the event as minor must have been strong. Great ships, after all, can have bumps. Great ships can stop for reasons. Great ships can investigate and proceed. That would have been the ordinary assumption. And here Titanic's reputation made things worse in a subtle way, because she seemed so grand, so mechanically assured, so unlike a fragile vessel. There was no immediate visual reason for passengers to think that the dark object just sighted ahead had placed them in mortal danger. The carpet still lay flat. The light still burned. The air inside was still warm. The decks were still mostly level. The crew were not yet screaming. The orchestra was not yet involved. The ship, in outward appearance, remained itself. But in those first minutes after the iceberg appeared, the essential future had already changed. The damage below the waterline was not cosmetic. Whether through popped rivets, opened seams, or hull plates giving way under the pressure of the impact, water was entering more compartments than Titanic had been designed to survive. That fact would take a little time to become fully known, but it did not wait for belief. The sea had begun its work already. Still, staying with the exact instant of sighting tells us something crucial about the whole disaster. Titanic was not lost because nobody saw the iceberg at all. It was seen. The system did, in its final and most urgent moment, function in the narrow sense. The lookouts were alert enough to spot danger. The bridge was warned, and action was taken. The tragedy lies partly in how little room remained when the sighting occurred. The chain from eyes to bell to telephone to helm worked, but the ship had already entered the zone where working correctly might no longer be enough. That is a hard truth in any technological story. We're often comforted by the idea that a system only fails when people fail completely. Titanic is more unsettling because the decisive moment includes people trying, reacting, and still losing the race against time and physics. That does not erase earlier judgment errors or the significance of speed and warning interpretation. Those things matter deeply. But the sighting itself is not a scene of laziness. It is a scene of sudden recognition followed by too late effort. Fleet's bell is therefore one of the most haunting sounds in the entire narrative. 3 strikes in the freezing dark. Not because they were ignored, but because they were not early enough to give the ship the clean escape she needed. There is something grimly precise about that. The warning was real. The response was real. The margin was not. Imagine again the view from the bow area or from one of the forward decks. A vast dark shape emerging ahead. The cold biting. The ship beginning to turn. Perhaps a strange scrape or trembling along the side. Then movement settling again into a different kind of uncertainty. No one yet knows the ending. No one yet knows how many compartments are open, how fast the sea is climbing, or whether this awkward brush with ice will become a famous disaster or a midnight annoyance. The human mind always wants a clear dividing line between before and after, but in practice these things blur. For several minutes after the iceberg appeared, Titanic still belonged to both worlds. She was still the grand liner crossing the Atlantic, and she was already the dying ship. The people aboard did not all know which version they were standing in. In some places, men were already lifting hatch covers, checking spaces, listening, feeling, reporting. Somewhere below, the first rushes of icy water were forcing knowledge onto those who had no luxury of doubt. Somewhere above, passengers were beginning to ask cautious questions in voices that still expected reassuring answers. The bridge, caught between these worlds, had to carry information upward and outward, while the ship herself kept her secret for just a little longer. So when we speak of the moment the iceberg appeared, we are not speaking only about a lookout seeing a shape. We are speaking about the instant when all the ship's advantages narrowed into one impossible problem. Her speed, once a sign of confident progress, became a burden. Her size, once a source of pride, made quick escape difficult. Her smoothness, once proof of fine engineering, helped make the collision less obviously catastrophic to those not at the point of impact. Her reputation, once a comfort, delayed the emotional recognition that something far worse than a minor accident had just occurred. And now the night had changed its terms. The iceberg was no longer ahead. It was astern, receding into darkness as if it had merely performed a task and moved on. Titanic remained brightly lit and full of people. But beneath that brightness, the sea was already entering the ship, room by room, compartment by compartment, turning a sighting into damage and damage into a countdown that almost no one on board yet understood. When Titanic made contact with the iceberg, the event did not announce itself with the kind of noise people later imagined. That is one of the strangest and most important facts in the whole story. If you ask someone who has only absorbed the disaster through popular culture, they often picture a tremendous impact, a violent shudder, people thrown from chairs, glass rattling in every room. Perhaps some immediate sense across the ship that a terrible accident has taken place. Real accounts do not support that picture. What happened, for many people on board, felt surprisingly slight. Enough to notice, perhaps. Enough to pause. Enough to ask, what was that? But not enough, in those first moments, to convince the average passenger that the greatest ship they had ever seen had just received a fatal injury. That gap between damage and sensation shaped everything that followed. In the first-class areas especially, where warmth, light, and order still held firm, many passengers experienced the collision as no more than a curious interruption. Some later described a gentle vibration, a scraping sensation, or a sort of long, drawn-out jar that was more odd than frightening. There was no great crash and collapse of furniture. Dinner service had already ended, of course, and the late-hour quiet meant there was less movement in public spaces, but where people were awake there was not instant panic. A few looked up from reading, a few opened cabin doors. Some asked stewards whether the ship had lost a propeller blade or done something similarly technical and annoying. The kind of mishap people are content to discuss, only because they assume it is not serious enough to change their evening in any meaningful way. That tells you a great deal about the ship itself. Titanic was so large, so stable, and so psychologically reassuring that even an iceberg collision did not immediately feel like a crisis in the places where passengers lived. The ship absorbed the moment in a way that concealed its danger. Her very strength, or at least the visible impression of strength she gave off, helped delay fear. If the same physical damage had struck a smaller or rougher vessel, passengers might have felt more sharply that something was wrong. On Titanic, comfort acted as a kind of disguise. There were even reports of some passengers joking about it, or at least treating the disturbance with mild curiosity rather than dread. That sounds shocking only if one forgets what they did not know. They did not know how the hull had been damaged below the waterline. They did not know how many compartments were already flooding. They did not know that a brief, almost modest sensation on the surface corresponded to a lethal series of openings along the starboard side. Without that knowledge, what was left was simply experience. And experience had not yet told them enough to be afraid. Human beings trust what their senses report in the moment, often more than what they are told later. If a room remains warm, the floor remains level, the lights remain on, and authority figures remain composed, then a strange scraping sensation is interpreted through those stable conditions. It becomes minor until proven otherwise, and that is exactly where Titanic entered one of the most dangerous stretches of the night, the part where the ship was already doomed in technical terms but not yet convincing in emotional terms. The collision itself seems to have been more of a long glancing blow than a single dramatic strike. Titanic had begun to turn after the iceberg was sighted, which likely spared her a head-on collision that might have killed many outright at the bow. Instead, The starboard side below the waterline brushed along the iceberg across several compartments. This was, in some ways, the worst possible kind of success. The ship avoided the clean frontal crash people instinctively fear, only to suffer a less obvious but far more fatal form of injury. She had not rammed the iceberg like a battering ram smashing into stone. She had scraped and torn herself against it, opening the ship to the sea in a way that was not spectacular from the passenger point of view, but catastrophic in engineering terms. It is worth sitting with that difference for a moment. We are used to thinking that the more violent an accident feels, the worse it must be. Titanic inverted that expectation. Because the impact felt muted, because the ship did not seem to stop dead, because the visible world on board was only gently disturbed, the seriousness of the event remained hidden. It was a disaster that entered quietly. Below the public decks, however, there was nothing quiet about the consequences. In the boiler rooms and forward compartments, men encountered the truth very quickly. Water began entering damaged spaces with brutal force. The sea at that latitude was bitterly cold, and when it forced itself into the ship, it did so without hesitation. Firemen, trimmers, engineers, and other crew members working in those lower regions were not in a position to treat the collision as a curious inconvenience. They saw the practical results at once. Water where there should never be water, pressure, speed, urgency, the kind of knowledge that does not require committee discussion. This is one of the sharpest contrasts in the Titanic story. In the cabins and lounges, people might still be straightening blankets, adjusting dressing gowns, or peering politely into corridors. Deep below, men were dealing with a direct invasion of the sea. The ship's true condition was not first understood by those in the grandest rooms, but by those closest to the wound. That feels fitting in a hard way. Reality usually arrives first where status matters least and consequences matter most. One can imagine the odd split-second worlds existing simultaneously inside the ship. In one place, a passenger says, "Did we stop?" In another, a crewman is already shouting over the noise of a rushing water. In one cabin, someone returns to bed. In another section of the vessel, men are realizing that compartments are flooding faster than anyone would like to admit. Titanic, at this stage, was not living through one single shared experience. She was breaking into separate realities depending on where you stood. The officers on the bridge and the senior men called to inspect the damage were caught in between these realities. They knew enough to understand that the collision had been serious. They did not yet know in the first few moments the full scale of the damage. So they entered the difficult zone of crisis leadership where one must gather fact quickly without creating either false comfort or needless alarm. Captain Smith was informed and came to the bridge. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was summoned to assess what had happened below. Reports came in from different parts of the ship. Water in the mailroom, water in forward compartments. Signs that this was not a simple scrape that could be shrugged off with professional calm. And yet, even as this grim picture formed among the men best placed to understand it, the passenger world remained strangely intact. That intactness was almost a character in the story. The electric lights still burned, the carpet still deadened footsteps, the wood panelling still looked elegant and permanent, the corridors still carried that insulated hush of an expensive ship at night. Nothing visible in the first-class interior shouted, "You must run." If anything, the ship encouraged the opposite instinct. Stay calm. Remain where you are. Let the staff sort it out. Titanic was built to make people believe in managed order, and in the first moments after the collision she kept doing that with impressive success. There is a dark irony in the fact that a ship designed to soothe its passengers became harder to abandon because it soothed them so well. Many accounts from survivors carry this same quiet confusion. Some recalled that they were awakened but not violently. Some noticed only a kind of tremor. Others heard the engines stop, which, in a ship accustomed to constant motion, might have been more noticeable than the collision itself. The cessation of engine vibration could be eerie, not because stopping a ship is in itself extraordinary, but because people often detect the absence of a familiar background sensation, more quickly than the presence of a brief unfamiliar one. Titanic had been a steady mechanical environment. When that continuity changed, attentive passengers may have felt that something had shifted, even if they could not yet tell what. That small sensory fact matters because it shows how subtle the whole beginning was. A person in bed might not wake for a glancing scrape, but may half wake because the ship now feels still in a new way. Someone sitting quietly might not leap up at impact, but might notice after a moment that the machinery no longer hums as it had before. A steward might not think this ship is mortally wounded, but he might think something has happened, and the officers will soon have instructions. The ship was moving from certainty to uncertainty by increments. As inspection continued, Andrews is believed to have grasped relatively quickly that Titanic's damage exceeded what her watertight compartment design could handle. The ship could survive flooding in a certain number of forward compartments, but not in as many as had now been breached. Water would fill the damaged sections, drag the bow lower, and then spill from one compartment to the next, because the bulkheads did not rise high enough to contain progressive flooding once the bow sank past a certain point. It was a terrible mechanical logic, simple once seen, impossible to bargain with. The ship had not been shattered in a dramatic public sense. She had been compromised in a technical sense that was even more final. This was the moment when the collision ceased to be an incident and became a sentence, though only a few men aboard knew it yet. Imagine being one of those men. Imagine standing inside the greatest liner in the world, surrounded by steel, engineering pride, and all the symbolic weight that came with her name, and realizing that the ship will sink, not might, will. Above you are hundreds upon hundreds of passengers, many not yet dressed, many still trusting the vessel completely, many about to need instructions that will sound absurd because the ship still looks solid. You know the mathematics already, but the people around you still live in appearances. That must have been one of the loneliest forms of knowledge on Earth. Meanwhile, ordinary life continued in patches for a little while longer. Some passengers, after feeling the collision, reportedly looked out from their cabins or stepped into the corridor, only to encounter crew members who were calm and not yet inclined to spread panic. That calm was partly professional and partly necessary. Crew were trained to maintain order. In the early stage of an emergency, a frightened crew can damage outcomes faster than a damaged ship, so composure remained the rule. But composure can also be misunderstood. Passengers interpret calm faces as evidence of safety. That is often reasonable. On Titanic, for a time it delayed action. And then there was class. The structure of the ship affected not only comfort but awareness. First-class passengers had greater proximity to spaces where crew communication and visible activity might eventually reveal seriousness. Yet they also enjoyed the greatest cocoon of comfort, which could encourage hesitation. Second-class passengers occupied an intermediate world, receiving less of the glamour but enough of the ship's order to remain reassured at first. Third-class passengers, farther from open decks and more dependent on direct instruction to understand what was expected, faced a different kind of uncertainty. The collision may have been just as muted where they were, but the path from mild disturbance to useful information was often longer and more complicated. This is crucial. The collision barely felt like disaster, not only because of physics, but because of social design. Information did not spread evenly through Titanic. Neither did confidence. Neither did access. The ship's hierarchy, which functioned as part of her ordinary order, did not vanish the moment she was hurt. It remained built into corridors, gates, assumptions, language, and the speed at which people were told what mattered. At the same time, many people did what people always do when reality is not yet clear. They minimized, they rationalized, they looked for the least alarming explanation that fit the available facts. A minor collision, a stop for precaution, a technical check, a pause due to ice, something inconveniencing perhaps, but not life-defining. This was not stupidity. It was pattern recognition under incomplete information. People reach first for familiar explanations, especially at night, especially in warm clothes, especially when the floor under them still feels largely dependable. There is also the hour to consider. Nearly midnight is not a heroic time of day, it is a foggy time of day. Minds are slower, bodies are less prepared, judgment is softer around the edges. If Titanic had struck in bright afternoon, with decks full of awake passengers seeing officers move sharply and men inspecting obvious damage, the emotional response might have been quite different. But she struck late, when many were asleep and others were preparing to sleep. That made the first stage of reaction naturally slower and more private. Some who did go up on deck after the collision were greeted by cold so sharp that the instinct to return inside must have been strong. And again, the visual contradiction was maddening. The night was clear, the ship was lit, the deck was not yet slanting dramatically, the vessel looked too substantial to be in mortal danger. Even after crew began instructing passengers to put on life jackets and come up, many interpreted this as caution rather than last chance. That interpretation had its roots here, in the nature of the collision itself. Because the blow had not felt catastrophic, later safety measures did not yet feel catastrophic either. The mind builds continuity. A minor bump leads to precaution. It does not leap immediately to sinking. One should not underestimate how difficult it is to step off a great ship into a small boat when the ship still appears safe. Lifeboats are persuasive only when the larger thing behind you has clearly ceased to be trustworthy. After Titanic's collision, there was a long stretch where that trust had been damaged in fact, but not yet in appearance. The collision barely felt like disaster, and so the idea of abandoning ship barely felt like reason. All the while, the sea kept entering below. That is the relentless part of the story. Human interpretation lagged. Water did not. The ocean required no debate, no confirmation from superiors, no proper Edwardian tone. It simply rose in the damaged spaces and moved the ship toward the fate Andrews had already recognised. The forward compartments took on water. The bow settled incrementally. The process was measured at first, not theatrical, which again made it hard for many above to feel its urgency. But measured does not mean reversible. Titanic had moved onto a slope that only steepened with time. It is tempting to imagine that someone should have burst through the corridors at once shouting the full truth. Yet even that assumes a clarity not everyone possessed at the exact same moment. Officers and designers were still confirming the scale. Crew needed instructions before they could give instructions. The ship had to move from collision to procedure, boats uncovered, passengers called, life jackets distributed, order imposed. A panic too early could be disastrous. A calm too long could be disastrous too. This was the narrow line they were walking. And then there is the human tendency to defer to setting. If you're told to dress warmly and come up on deck, but the grand staircase still gleams, and the ship beneath you still feels dignified, you are likely to obey slowly. You may take time to gather belongings. You may ask whether your husband should come now or later. You may lace boots carefully. You may complain that the whole thing is inconvenient and badly explained. It is a terrible feature of human behaviour that we remain attached to proper habits even when events have already outgrown them. Titanic's passengers were not reacting to a battlefield. They were reacting to a disturbance inside a world explicitly designed to reward composure and routine. So the collision barely felt like disaster, because it was, in sensory terms, too polite. It did not break enough things where enough people could see them. It did not instantly tear apart the illusion of safety. It did not make the ship look weak. It injured Titanic in a hidden, distributed, technically devastating way, while leaving much of her visible life untouched for a fatal stretch of time. That is why so many later recollections begin in understatement. It did not seem serious. I hardly noticed it. I thought it was nothing much. These are not embarrassing admissions. They are the natural language of a disaster that concealed itself unusually well at the start. This concealment also helped produce one of the most haunting emotional tones of the entire night: delayed understanding. People were not ignorant because nothing had happened. They were slow to understand because what had happened did not match what disaster is supposed to feel like. The impact was too soft for the consequence. The setting was too elegant for immediate terror. The crew were too composed. The ship was too famous. Everything about Titanic encouraged one more minute of trust, then another, then another. But the lower decks were already telling a different story. Men there did not need dramatic impact to know the ship was in real trouble. Water flooding boiler rooms and compartments was argument enough. Reports moved upward. Calculations hardened. The list of safe possibilities grew shorter. On the passenger decks, however, time was still being spent in that fog of incomplete belief, and each minute spent there made later choices harder. Soon people would be asked to leave cabins that still looked habitable. Soon they would be guided toward lifeboats that looked smaller and colder than the ship they were standing on. Soon the gap between what the collision had felt like and what it had actually done would become impossible to ignore. Before that happened, though, there remained this strange middle period where the vessel still held together outwardly, the light still burned, the night still looked almost orderly, and Titanic, mortally wounded but not yet ready to show it plainly, carried her passengers forward into the slower, harder realization that she was not going to survive at all. What happened below deck in those first minutes after the collision was far clearer, far colder, and far less open to denial than anything most passengers experienced above. On the upper levels, people could still debate whether the scrape had been serious. They could still stand in warm corridors and ask polite questions. They could still interpret the interruption as some technical inconvenience that competent men would sort out before anyone's sleep was truly disturbed. Deep inside the ship, there was no such luxury. The sea had already arrived, and the men working closest to the ship's hidden body knew at once that this was not a matter of inconvenience. Titanic was built as a floating world, but like any world that wants to appear graceful from above, she depended on spaces most people preferred not to think about. Boiler rooms, coal bunkers, engine spaces, shaft alleys, storerooms, cargo holds, mail compartments, pumping systems, steel doors, ladders, narrow passages, heat, noise, soot, routine labour, and the constant management of machinery. Passengers experienced the ship as polished wood, electric light, and steady service. The people who work below experienced her as work. They were the ones feeding the boilers, moving coal, monitoring pressure, checking systems, keeping steam up, keeping order in an environment far removed from the silver and linen of the dining saloons. If the ship's grand public life was the performance, these lower decks were the machinery behind the curtain. That is why the truth entered there first. Not because the sea cared about class, though it did not, but because the hull had been opened low and forward, below the waterline, where the ship's glamorous surfaces gave way to steel, rivets, compartments, and the practical geography of operation. The damage was not something most passengers could see from the promenade. It was something workers and officers had to go down and meet directly. In the forward boiler rooms and adjacent spaces, the first signs were not subtle. Water forcing its way through damaged sections of the hull does not leave much room for interpretation. Men in those areas would have heard it, seen it, and felt the temperature shift with alarming speed. One moment the ship was functioning, noisy but ordered, an environment of heat and labour. The next, seawater was entering with pressure enough to make all argument pointless. The Atlantic at that latitude in April was brutally cold. It did not seep in like a household leak, it invaded. There are reports and reconstructions from survivors and later inquiries that help form the likely picture. In Boiler Room 6, one of the forward boiler rooms, leading fireman Frederick Barrett was among those who became aware very quickly that water was entering. Barrett later described hearing the order to shut the watertight doors and seeing the reality of the flooding. That detail alone tells you how fast the ship had to shift from routine to emergency below. These were not men standing around philosophizing about safety features. They were suddenly operating inside them, trying to survive long enough to carry out the next instruction. The watertight doors are always mentioned in the Titanic story with a kind of tragic respect, and fairly so. They represented modern design, the promise that compartmentalization could save a damaged ship. When the collision occurred, these doors were triggered to close, sealing off sections of the vessel to slow flooding. In principle, this was exactly what they were for. In practice, the damage extended across too many compartments. Closing the doors was necessary, disciplined and immediate, but it could not reverse the scale of the wound. The system functioned, and the ship was still lost. That is one of the more disturbing elements of the disaster. Failure did not come because every safeguard failed to act. It came because the safeguards had limits. Imagine those lower spaces in the minutes after impact. The noise of machinery, the heat from the boilers, the confined air, the rough surfaces and narrow ladders. Men used to hard work and hard conditions, but not to the sea suddenly claiming the room. Someone shouts, someone looks toward a breach or a rapidly rising line of water. Someone moves to obey the door order. Someone realizes that a few more seconds in the wrong place could mean being trapped. These are not polished dramatic gestures. They are practical reactions under pressure, carried out by workers who didn't have the luxury of turning a crisis into a speech. That is also where Titanic begins to feel different from the way she's often remembered. Popular memory favours the grand staircase, the deck, the musicians, the lifeboats, the flares. All of those belong to the story, but before the disaster became visible in those upper spaces, it was already brutally real in the industrial core of the ship. Steam, steel, water, labour. It began there, in places where men got dirty, tired, and overlooked even on an ordinary day. The mail room offers another striking example. Titanic was carrying large quantities of mail, and the postal clerks aboard were responsible for sorting it during the voyage. This was not decorative work. Ocean liners were important links in communication, and the mail room was part of that larger machine. When water entered those forward compartments, the clerks were among the first people confronted by the physical fact of flooding. Bags of mail, paper, packages, and government responsibility were suddenly sharing space with icy seawater. There is something grimly fitting about that image. The modern world, so proud of its speed and systems, meeting the Atlantic in a room full of letters that would never arrive. The sea below deck also changed the rhythm of time. Above, time still moved in social terms. People were dressing, deciding, hesitating, asking questions. Below, time turned mechanical. How fast is the water rising? Which compartments are hit? Can the pumps manage any of it? Which doors are sealed? How long can men stay in position? Can the fires be kept going long enough to supply electricity, power, and pumps? Every minute down there had a different weight. It was not measured by clocks and conversation, but by levels, pressure, access, and the narrowing usefulness of each action. One of the hardest truths about Titanic's final hours is that some men below deck were effectively helping the ship survive long enough for others to get clear, even while the ship itself could no longer be saved. Engineers, firemen, trimmers, electricians, and others continued working in worsening conditions because the ship still needed light, pumps, and electrical power. Passengers later remembered the lights remaining on for a long time, and that was not magic. It was labour. It was men staying with systems that were becoming steadily more dangerous to manage. The relative calm above depended in part on the persistence of work below. That should not be romanticised into something unreal, but it should be respected. These were not abstract symbols of duty. They were working crew in dangerous spaces, many of whom understood enough to know that conditions were worsening and that their own chances were poor. The better-known parts of the story often focus on visible courage, and visible courage is easier to admire. Hidden courage is quieter. It looks like shoveling coal, monitoring pressure, keeping current flowing, obeying instructions in heat and noise while freezing water approaches from the wrong direction. As inspections continued, Thomas Andrews and senior officers gained a clearer picture of the damage pattern. Water was entering the first compartments forward, more than the ship could tolerate. The design could handle flooding in a certain number of compartments, but the iceberg had opened too many. This is the point where the lower decks, more than any public room or passenger impression, dictated the truth. The ship's fate was being written there by geometry and water. No amount of composure on the bridge could alter the basic arithmetic. The bow would settle, water would climb. Once the front of the ship dipped low enough, flooding would progress from one compartment to the next because the tops of the bulkheads were not high enough to stop it. Titanic was not merely damaged, she had entered a sequence. That sequence began physically, not emotionally. That is why so many passengers took time to understand what the men below either already knew or soon suspected. Human beings tend to believe what they can see. Down below, the evidence was immediate. Above, there was still carpet, woodwork, and normal lighting. Below, there was water where there should have been none. Above, there were questions. Below, there were answers, and the answers were bad. There is another important detail here. The collision did not create one single dramatic hole that anyone could point to and understand at a glance. The damage was distributed along sections of the starboard side. That matters because it meant flooding affected multiple spaces in a pattern that made the ship's compartment system insufficient. It also meant that for many men below, the first experience was not standing before one giant rupture in disbelief, but encountering water in places that should have been secure, realizing that this space is going, then that one, then the next. The ship was not being torn apart in public view. She was being opened in several crucial places below the line passengers never saw. If you picture the lower decks only as anonymous mechanical zones, it is worth correcting that. They were full of people, routines and skill. Firemen were feeding furnaces, trimmers were moving coal, engineers were tending systems, greasers and oilers worked in hot, confined conditions most passengers would never have tolerated for 5 minutes. Postal clerks handled mail, stewards and service staff moved through storage and working passages. These were not blank spaces waiting to be flooded for the convenience of later storytelling. They were active parts of the ship's daily life. When the sea entered, it entered somebody's workplace first. That gives the early minutes of flooding a more human shape. A crewman on a ladder hearing a sudden report from another compartment. A postal clerk trying to save or move mail bags before the effort becomes hopeless. Men forced to retreat not because anyone has formally ended the task, but because the water itself has ended it. Someone slamming a door, climbing fast, turning once to look back. There is no elegance in these movements, only urgency and the rough discipline of work turning into survival. The temperature contrast must have been shocking too. Boiler rooms were hot, oppressive environments under normal conditions. Men there worked stripped down to undershirts or light layers in the heat of furnaces and steam. To have freezing seawater burst into that environment was not simply dangerous. It was physically grotesque, like two worlds colliding inside the same room. Heat from the boilers, cold from the Atlantic, steel surfaces, noise and rushing water. It would have been confusing in the most bodily sense, not the sort of confusion that comes from uncertainty, but the sort that comes from too much reality arriving all at once. There is a temptation when telling this part of the story to move too quickly to lifeboats and deck scenes, because those are more familiar and easier to visualize. Yet the hidden struggle below explains why the later outward calm lasted as long as it did. The engines did not instantly fail. The lights did not vanish at once. The ship did not immediately rear into some nightmare shape. All of that took time, and that time was purchased partly by the men below continuing to work. The great liner still looked orderly because the industrial heart of the ship was still being managed as long as possible. Even the act of slowing the flooding, or attempting to, had a grim dignity to it. Pumps were used, doors were shut, reports were sent. Officers moved between assessment and instruction. Men remained at posts. None of it would save Titanic in the end, but that does not make it meaningless. In a disaster, not every action is aimed at total rescue. Some actions are about buying minutes. minutes for orders to be given properly, minutes for lifeboats to be uncovered, minutes for passengers to be stirred from sleep, coaxed into coats, persuaded into boats they do not yet trust. A great deal of what happened below deck was really a fight for minutes, and those minutes mattered. There is also a class truth here that is uncomfortable but necessary. The people facing the sea first were not the people later most associated with the ship's glamour. They were workers, many of them from backgrounds far removed from the first-class dining room. That is often how large systems behave. The danger reaches the labouring body first. Those who support the structure feel the break sooner than those who enjoy its comforts. Titanic was a rigidly organised vessel, and in her first truly fatal moments, that organisation showed itself clearly. The lower decks took the blow into human life before the upper decks understood what had happened. Some of these men escaped upward. Some did not. Some continued working because the ship still required them. Some were trapped by the speed of flooding, or by the simple cruelty of being in the wrong compartment at the wrong moment. Histories of Titanic sometimes mention them collectively, which is understandable given the scale of the loss. But the collective view can make it too easy to forget that each was an individual living through those minutes from inside his own body. Someone coughing in hot air and then suddenly hit by freezing spray. Someone pulling himself through a closing doorway. Someone looking up a ladder and realising how far he has to go. Someone hearing the watertight doors and knowing exactly why they are moving. Meanwhile, above, passengers were still only beginning to stir. That contrast never loses its force. A ship full of sleeping people is one thing. A ship full of sleeping people above compartments already taking on the Atlantic is another. It means the true beginning of the disaster was hidden beneath comfort. While a woman in first class adjusted a shawl and asked a steward what the trouble was somewhere below, the practical answer was already sloshing across steel plates. While a second-class passenger tried to decide whether the order to put on a life jacket was excessive, the lower decks were no longer dealing in questions of excess. They were dealing in water levels. While families in third class tried to understand where to go and why, the ship's injury was already spreading in the spaces they could not see. That invisibility is part of why the story stayed so confused for so long in memory. Many survivors did not witness the real beginning of the sinking. They felt the consequences of decisions made because of it, but the event itself took place beyond their sight, below their feet, in the ship's industrial anatomy. If one wanted to design a disaster that would produce hesitation, mixed signals and delayed belief, one could hardly do better than to place the fatal wound in hidden working spaces, while leaving the public rooms warm and the lamps still glowing. And yet those lower spaces were not merely where the sea entered. They were where Titanic's claim to control met its limit. Every modern feature that had inspired confidence now had to prove itself under stress. Watertight doors closed, pumps worked, engineers assessed, systems held for a while, but for a while is not the same as enough. The ship had been designed to survive damage up to a point. The collision pushed beyond that point. Below deck, this was not theory or reputation. It was observable fact. The sea was making use of the ship's structure faster than the structure could defeat it. One can imagine Thomas Andrews moving through those spaces or receiving reports from them, already understanding the sequence that would follow. Men on the lower decks would have had their own version of that understanding, more practical and less formal. They may not have needed diagrams to know when a compartment was done for. Workers used to machinery are often quick judges of what cannot be argued with. A little leak can be managed. A rush of freezing water into multiple spaces is not a little leak. There is a brutal honesty in industrial environments. They teach people early that materials have limits, and that once those limits are crossed, pride becomes irrelevant. That honesty was only beginning to work its way upward through the ship. Soon, it would take the form of instructions, then lifeboats, then urgency on deck. For the moment, though, the lower decks remained the place where appearance and reality were farthest apart. The ship still looked magnificent to most of those aboard. Down below, magnificence had already been replaced by steel, water, and the hard knowledge that the Atlantic had found its way in. The sea was not finished with those spaces either. It would keep climbing, keep driving men back, keep reducing machinery to useless metal, keep transforming workrooms into flooded chambers and ordered compartments into part of the ship's downward weight. The ship's hidden life, which had made everything above possible, was being extinguished section by section. As that happened, the upper world of Titanic would begin to lose its calm in a more visible way. Orders would sharpen, passengers would gather, lifeboats would become more than a precaution. The people on deck would soon start to feel, in social terms, what the people below had already learned in practical ones. This was not a scrape, not an inconvenience, and not a problem to be solved quietly before midnight passed. It was the beginning of a fight the ship could only delay, never win, and that grim truth was already moving upward through the vessel, one compartment at a time. The realization did not arrive everywhere at once. That is one of the most important things to understand about Titanic in the period after the collision and the first flooding below deck. There was no single announcement that instantly transformed the ship from a comfortable liner into a shared emergency in the minds of all aboard. The change moved through the vessel unevenly. It passed first through officers and engineers, then through crew carrying instructions, then through passengers who were more alert, more observant, or simply closer to whatever part of the ship was beginning to tell the truth more plainly. For others, the shift took longer. Some still thought in terms of inconvenience, while a few men already knew they were standing inside a ship that could not be saved. That difference in awareness shaped every minute that followed. Thomas Andrews, after inspecting the damage or receiving enough reliable reports from the flooded compartments, understood that Titanic was not merely badly hurt. She was lost. The iceberg had opened too many of the forward compartments for the ship's design to cope. Water would continue to fill them, pulling the bow lower. Once the bow sank past a certain level, the tops of the bulkheads between compartments would no longer hold back progressive flooding. Water would spill onward. The process had its own logic. It was indifferent to the ship's size, cost, fame, elegance, and public reputation. That is often the harshest part of technical failure. It does not care how much confidence has been invested in a thing. It simply follows the rules already built into material and motion. Andrews is reported to have told Captain Smith that the ship had perhaps an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours before she would sink. That estimate matters because it set the pace of everything else. The officers were not dealing with a situation that might develop by morning, nor one that allowed leisurely preparation. They had time, but not enough of it, especially for a ship carrying more than 2,000 people, with lifeboat capacity for only a fraction of them. Once the ship's fate was understood at that level, the question ceased to be whether Titanic would survive and became how to use the remaining time without losing order too soon. Captain Smith now stood in one of the most terrible positions any ship's commander can occupy. A collision has happened. The ship is doomed. Most of the passengers do not yet understand that. The physical evidence on the upper deck still does not fully support the gravity of what must now be done. You are responsible not only for acknowledging reality, but for moving hundreds upon hundreds of people toward action before that reality becomes impossible to manage. Too much alarm, too soon, and confusion may spiral. Too little urgency for too long, and precious minutes vanish into hesitation. So the orders began in the controlled language of maritime emergency. Lifeboats were to be uncovered and swung out. Passengers were to be roused and told to put on life jackets. Women and children would be loaded first. Wireless distress calls would be sent. Crew would be stationed. Stewards would move through accommodation spaces waking people and directing them upward. The ship, still calm in many visible ways, began quietly preparing for her own abandonment. This is where the slow realization becomes deeply human. The people giving the orders knew more than the people receiving them. The people receiving them often heard them through the filter of setting. Imagine being awakened in a warm cabin by a steward speaking politely, perhaps not much louder than needed, instructing you to put on warm clothes and a life belt and come up on deck. You are groggy. It is late. The room still feels safe. The bed still looks inviting. Nothing in your senses says the largest ship you have ever boarded is now on borrowed time. The natural reaction is not instant terror. It is confusion, annoyance, reluctance, or mild concern. People in that state do not move like people running from fire. Some did not want to get up at all. Some thought it was a precaution. Some asked whether it was necessary. Some dressed carefully, more carefully than the hour justified, because people cling to ordinary habits when they do not yet believe those habits have become pointless. Women buttoned coats, men tied scarves, children were wrapped in blankets, passengers collected valuables, some put on too many layers, some not enough, some returned to fetch forgotten items. There is always something quietly painful in those small acts. They show how long the mind holds onto the possibility that normal life will resume after this interruption has passed. On the decks, the first visible preparations were underway. Lifeboat covers came off, fulls were checked, crew assembled, officers began organising the loading process, and still, even now, the ship did not fully look like a place in mortal danger. She was not yet plunging forward at some dramatic angle. The decks were usable. The electric lights were still on. The sea was black and cold, but the ship remained brightly lit and physically imposing. Standing beside a lifeboat on Titanic's deck in those early stages, a passenger could look at the boat and then at the ship and make what seemed like a perfectly sensible emotional judgment. The big thing looks safer than the small thing. That judgment would prove fatal for some. It is easy to condemn it with hindsight. It is much harder to imagine yourself making the opposite choice while the ship still seems steady underfoot. The officers loading the boats faced an awful psychological challenge. They had to persuade or order people into fragile-looking lifeboats while the vessel behind them remained warm, illuminated, and apparently more secure. Lifeboats are comforting in theory. In practice, on a freezing Atlantic night, they look exposed, cramped, and miserable. To enter one meant leaving behind enclosed spaces, heat, personal belongings, and the social reassurance of the ship. Without a clear, visible sign that Titanic was dying, many people hesitated. Some even resisted. This is why the realization came slowly. It was not only that facts took time to spread, it was that facts were competing with appearances. A person may hear the word lifeboat and still believe that this is precautionary evacuation, a temporary inconvenience until rescue or transfer can be arranged. In fact, many early boat occupants likely believed exactly that. They did not think they were saying goodbye to Titanic forever. They thought they were stepping away from the ship for safety while she awaited assistance, or remained afloat long enough for everyone else to follow in good order. The wireless operators, meanwhile, had moved fully into emergency mode. Distress calls were transmitted. The CQD signal, already in use as a distress call, was sent, and the newer SOS signal was used as well. Ships in the area responded or attempted to respond. Positions were exchanged. Hope, at least in formal procedure, still existed. There were other vessels somewhere in the Atlantic. There was communication. There was structure. Yet even here, time remained the enemy. A response is not rescue unless it arrives in time. On a map, help can look deceptively near. On cold open water at night, distance is cruelly practical. Passengers did not experience this part of the story as one shared narrative. First class, second class, and third class all encountered the growing emergency differently. In first class, some passengers reached the boat deck relatively early and had more direct contact with officers or stewards. Yet they also faced the strong temptation of surroundings that still looked civilized. Some men joked. Some women were reluctant to leave husbands behind because the seriousness of the situation still did not feel final. In second class, confusion mixed with obedience, and social expectations still shaped conduct. In third class, the difficulty could be even greater. Language barriers affected some. Access routes were less direct. Understanding depended heavily on when and how instructions reached them. It is not accurate to say one simple thing about all third-class passengers, but it is fair to say that the ship's structure and hierarchy did not make swift, equal comprehension easy. This is often where the myth of instant panic misleads people. Titanic did not erupt into full chaos the moment the truth became known to a few senior men. Human societies rarely transform that quickly, especially when authority is still functioning and the setting still appears stable. Instead, the ship entered a phase of layered emotional weather. Some people were worried, some were still skeptical, some crew members knew enough to be grimly focused. Some passengers treated the situation as serious but not yet terminal. Others did not yet understand why they had been brought outside into such bitter cold. On a ship as large as Titanic, with classes separated and movement controlled by architecture and crew direction, the emergency existed in different emotional forms at the same time, and yet the ship herself kept speaking slowly but increasingly clearly. The bow settled lower. Water was creeping farther into the forward parts of the ship. People on deck began to notice that the forward well deck seemed closer to the sea than it should have been. The angle underfoot, though still slight, was no longer purely imaginary. At first these changes might be dismissed. Ships move, ships settle. A person standing outside in darkness may not trust his own sense of level immediately. But as the minutes passed, the physical signs accumulated. Titanic was beginning to look less like a temporarily inconvenienced liner, and more like a vessel in real trouble. That physical evidence changed behaviour. Some passengers who had hesitated became more compliant. Some who had laughed stopped laughing. The crew's instructions no longer felt merely ceremonial. Still, the realization remained staggered. For every person starting to grasp that the ship might truly sink, there was another still telling himself that great ships do not vanish like this. There is always a lag between the breaking of reality and the surrender of belief. The band is often remembered in this part of the story, and while memory has polished some details into legend, the broader truth is that music did play on deck or near the deck for a time, helping calm passengers. That detail is important not because it is romantic, but because it shows how order was being actively preserved. Music in such a moment is not proof that everything is fine. It is proof that those in charge still believe calm is useful. To a passenger, however, the effect could be misleading. If musicians are playing, if officers are controlled, if the lights remain steady, then perhaps this really is under management. Perhaps it is grave but not hopeless. Perhaps there will be enough boats. Perhaps another ship is close. Perhaps there is time. Perhaps is a dangerous word in a sinking ship. It buys emotional comfort at the cost of decision speed. Lifeboat loading itself deepened the confusion in the early stages. Some boats were lowered with empty seats because not enough people believed in the urgency, because officers interpreted women and children first with varying strictness, because crew feared overloading boats before understanding exactly how the davits and lowering process would behave, and because people were still not psychologically ready to trade Titanic for a small open craft. Later generations, looking at empty spaces in boats and full decks behind them, find the scene maddening, but the emptiness tells you exactly how incomplete realization still was. If everyone on board had fully believed what Andrews knew, those boats would have been packed from the beginning. One can picture the conversations. Surely there will be another boat. I don't want to leave my husband. It looks safer on the ship. Do we really need these life jackets? How long will we be in the boat? These are not the words of people who have accepted finality. They are the words of people still negotiating with uncertainty. Titanic's physical condition was moving in only one direction, but human understanding was catching up by degrees. There was also the moral strain on the officers. They had to enforce loading under conditions that were neither calm enough for comfort, nor obviously desperate enough to make compliance automatic. They were balancing rules, social expectations, incomplete time, and the visible dignity of the ship itself. Some officers were more forceful than others. Some loaded boats differently. These variations are unsurprising in a real emergency, though they are uncomfortable to study. Once the ship's doom was known among command, every decision became cruelly weighted. Send the boat now or wait for more women and children. Admit this man or refuse him. Keep order by speaking calmly or sharpen the tone. Every choice consumed time and shaped survival. The men who remained on deck with wives, daughters or sisters entering boats faced their own slow realization too. At first, some likely assumed that the women and children would go temporarily, that the men would follow in later boats, that rescue was close, or that Titanic would remain afloat long enough for the process to continue in some orderly manner. Only later would the truth harden. There were not enough boats, not enough time, and for many men the act of helping family into a lifeboat would also be the act of watching the last viable chance pull away from the ship. This is one reason the disaster feels so haunting even beyond its scale. It did not force understanding all at once. It let people understand in pieces. A husband might first realise that his wife must board, then that he will not, then that the ship is listing more, then that the next boat may not have room, then that the sea is visibly closer. That kind of step-by-step recognition can be harder to bear than a single blow, because each step still offers a little time for hope before taking more of it away. Third class, again, felt this differently. Families there were often slower to reach the boat deck, slower to receive clear information, and more dependent on crew direction through unfamiliar passages. Some found gates or barriers that delayed movement, though the exact experience varied and later retellings have often simplified it. What is certain is that many in steerage were at a disadvantage in speed, clarity and access. For them, realization may have come with extra layers of confusion. Why are we being moved now? Which way is the boat deck? Are we allowed through here? Is this for everyone? Should we wait? A disaster is always shaped by structure before it is shaped by memory, and Titanic's structure was not neutral. The sea, meanwhile, kept solving the argument. The forward part of the ship settled lower still. More of the front deck areas neared the water. The deck angle became harder to dismiss. The cold itself intensified the sense that this was no longer a controlled inconvenience. Lifeboats were disappearing downward into the dark one after another. Officers' voices carried differently now. The ship's body had begun to say what words alone had not yet fully achieved. She was not going to recover. She was moving, slowly but unmistakably, toward failure. And still the realization was not complete for everyone. Some returned to cabins for possessions, some lingered. Some believed that there would be time enough. This is where Titanic becomes a study not only in engineering but in human delay. People need the world to contradict their trust very firmly before they abandon it. Titanic had built that trust over days and displayed it in steel, heat, and order. It would take more than one quiet collision and a few urgent instructions to strip that trust away. The ship had to keep sinking into view before many finally believed. By now, though, the mood had changed decisively among those paying attention. The jokes had thinned out. The reluctance in some faces had been replaced by dawning fear. Passengers in boats, looking back upward, could see the great liner sitting strangely in the water, lit against the darkness in a way that now looked less comforting than unreal. Those still on deck saw boats leaving and empty space where safety had been. The line between precaution and catastrophe was fading. Even the ordinary sounds of the ship would have taken on new meaning. The absence of full engine vibration. Orders shouted, winches and tackle, footsteps on deck, distant movement below, the quiet patches between voices. On a normal night, these sounds would blend into the ship's routine life. Now they were becoming the soundtrack of dwindling options. Every lowered boat changed the arithmetic. Every passing minute deepened the angle and shortened the future. So the realization that Titanic would not survive came partly through authority, partly through physical evidence, partly through the behaviour of others, and partly through the disappearance of alternatives. No one had to hold a grand philosophical meeting on deck. The ship herself was deciding the matter. She'd been breached beyond salvation. The officers were acting on that knowledge. The boats were going. The bow was lowering. The sea was rising. At some point, for each person aboard, there came a moment when the mind stopped saying perhaps and started saying this is real. Those moments did not happen together. They spread through the ship one by one, family by family, officer by officer, passenger by passenger, until the great illusion of Titanic as a place that would carry everyone safely onward began to fail as surely as the ship's forward compartments already had, and the night moved into the next stage, where uncertainty no longer softened what had to be done. By the time Titanic had moved from private doubt into visible emergency, the boat deck had become the centre of a very strange kind of struggle. It was not a battlefield in the usual sense. It was colder, quieter in patches, more formal in its surface behaviour, and for a while still constrained by the habits of class, discipline, and Edwardian self-control. But it was a struggle all the same. Space in the lifeboats was limited. Time was moving in one direction. The officers were trying to impose order on a situation that was becoming harder to explain with calm voices alone. And all around them, the lamp still burned, the ship's electric light falling across polished surfaces, white life jackets, dark coats, ropes, davits, and the faces of people who had not all reached the same conclusion at the same time. That bright light mattered more than people sometimes realise. If Titanic had already been dark when most of the lifeboats were loaded, panic might have arrived faster and in a cruder form. Darkness strips away the illusion of control. Titanic, for much of the evacuation, remained lit. Her lamps and interior electric lights gave the ship an unnatural appearance against the black Atlantic, almost as if she were still fully herself, only inconvenienced, only paused. The brightness calmed some people. It also misled them. A brightly lit ship looks capable. A brightly lit ship still feels inhabited by system and authority. The light said, in effect, that civilization was still present. The sea, slowly climbing toward them, said something else. On the boat deck, the officers were now loading and lowering lifeboats in earnest. This sounds straightforward when summarised, but in practice it was full of hesitation, variation, and bitter compromise. Titanic carried 20 boats in total, including collapsibles, which was nowhere near enough for everyone on board. That fact, terrible as it is, didn't yet produce instant panic for a simple reason. Most passengers did not know the exact arithmetic, and many still did not believe the ship would sink before help arrived, or before all who needed boats could be moved clear. The officers, meanwhile, were enforcing women and children first, but not every officer interpreted that phrase in exactly the same way. Some took it to mean women and children only, unless no such passengers were immediately available for a given boat. Others allowed men in more readily once space appeared likely to go unused. This created differences from boat to boat, not because the officers were inventing chaos for the pleasure of future historians, but because real emergencies rarely produce uniform behaviour. At first, some lifeboats left shockingly underfilled. That is one of the hardest facts in the whole evacuation to sit with. There was space, there were people, yet boats descended with empty seats. Part of this came from caution. The crew were still learning, in practical terms, how the davits would handle full loads and how the lowering process would behave with the ship's slight but increasing angle. Part of it came from reluctance among passengers, especially women who did not want to leave husbands, fathers or brothers standing on the deck behind them, while the ship still looked safer than the small open boat hanging over black water. Part of it came from the simple difficulty of convincing people that the risk had already passed the point where hesitation was reasonable, and part of it came from the old human habit of thinking there will be another chance. Imagine yourself there. You're standing under electric light on the deck of the largest ship in the world. The deck is cold, but it is solid. There are officers, seamen, stewards, and perhaps musicians somewhere still playing to steady nerves. The sea below is freezing black emptiness. The lifeboat beside you looks narrow, exposed and unpleasant. Your husband is saying perhaps you should wait. Your wife is saying she does not want to go without you. Someone else says it is only a precaution. A crewman insists. Another passenger hesitates. There are ropes creaking, orders being repeated, names or numbers of boats being called. It is not hard to see how delay could happen. What feels hard from the future is knowing what that delay would cost. The lamps also made the deck feel staged in a way that must have been deeply disorienting. A disaster in full daylight belongs clearly to the physical world. You can see the ship's angle, the sea's position, the crowd's behaviour, the expressions on faces. A disaster at night, under artificial light, can feel more theatrical and less real until something undeniable breaks through. Titanic's deck was lit from within by her own systems. The result was a kind of false frame around events. People stood in pools of warm-looking light, while beyond the rails the Atlantic was empty and black. The lifeboats swinging out and lowering down vanished into darkness almost immediately once they dropped beyond the ship's side. The ship itself remained visible, orderly-looking, even elegant. That contrast likely made the process more unreal, not less. As more passengers reached the boat deck, the emotional tone changed by degrees. The earlier stage had been confusion and polite hesitation. Then came a middle stage where concern sharpened, but people still tried to behave as if the situation might resolve through procedure. Now, with more boats departing, more visible activity, and more evidence that the ship's bow was indeed settling lower, concern began hardening into fear. Not all at once, and not in the same way for every person, but noticeably. A woman who might earlier have resisted entering a boat could now see other boats already gone and realise there would not be endless opportunities. A man who had treated the event lightly might now feel the first real edge of helplessness, as rules about women and children cut directly across his own survival. That is where panic begins, not always as screaming or trampling, but as the point where private fear starts interfering with shared order. Panic can be loud, but it can also be stubbornness, pleading, argument, sudden refusal, or impulsive movement. Titanic's boat deck did not instantly become a scene of full breakdown. The officers and crew were too active, and many passengers were too conditioned by social restraint for that. But order was beginning to fray at the edges. Every lowered boat increased the pressure on those left behind. Every visible sign that the ship was still sinking changed the meaning of the next decision. Crew discipline was vital here, and in many cases impressive. Men were assigned to boats, ropes, oars, passengers, and loading. Stewards guided women forward. Officers stood with authority, some armed, all burdened with choices that became worse by the minute. The work demanded clarity of voice and steadiness of hand. A boat could not simply be thrown over the side and hoped for. It had to be filled enough to matter, but not overloaded in a way that seemed likely to break the lowering process. The fulls had to run properly. The plugs had to be in place. Boat crews had to know where to row once waterborne. Even in catastrophe, mechanics insisted on being respected. Meanwhile, social habits that had seemed ornamental on ordinary days now had real effects. Men stepped back because they had been raised or trained to do so for women and children. Some did so with calm courage, some with stiff, outward control hiding private fear, and some perhaps because they still half believed that another boat would come for them later. Women, in turn, didn't always behave like passive recipients of rescue. Some refused to enter without male relatives. Some argued. Some had to be persuaded or lifted in. Some were more frightened of the small boat than of the huge ship. That was not irrational given appearances. It was tragic because appearances had become unreliable. One of the cruel details of this stage is how much depended on simple timing. Arrive too early and you might hesitate because the ship still looks safe. Arrive too late and the boats might already be gone or difficult to reach. Reach the right officer at the right moment and a rule might be interpreted one way. Reach a different part of the deck and it might be interpreted another. Titanic's evacuation was not one smooth conveyor belt. It was a series of local decisions under growing pressure. That is why later survivor accounts vary so much in tone. Some remember relative calm, others recall fear sharpening quickly. Both can be true, because they were standing in different pockets of the same failing system. The distress rockets added another layer to the scene. Fired into the night, they were meant to signal the ship's need for help. To those aboard, they also served as visible proof that the situation had passed well beyond routine caution. Ships do not fire rockets for a minor inconvenience. Even if some passengers did not understand the exact code or procedure, the sight of flares rising into the sky and bursting over a freezing sea must have cut through the soft habits of disbelief for many. Yet even here, the effect was mixed. A flare implies danger, yes, but also rescue. It says someone is calling for help, which can support hope as much as fear. Perhaps another ship is near. Perhaps the boats are only a temporary measure. Perhaps the night will still end in survival for everyone. Hope remained active on the deck, and hope can be both useful and dangerous depending on what it encourages people to do. The musicians, too, remain part of this stage for good reason. Whether every reported detail of the final playlist is perfectly accurate matters less than the broader fact that music was used to maintain calm. A ship with music still playing does not feel fully surrendered to chaos. That was the point. The officers needed time. The crew needed compliance. The music helped keep people from tipping too early into blind fear. Yet the very success of such calming measures could also slow emotional recognition. A person listening to familiar tunes under electric light, in the presence of composed officers, could still tell himself that there was structure here, that the evacuation, however unpleasant, remained under control. In one sense, that was true. In another sense, control was shrinking with every boat lowered. The physical position of the ship was becoming harder to ignore now. The bow sat lower. The forward well deck was closer to the sea. People at the stern or farther aft might still feel less immediate alarm, but on the boat deck the signs were strengthening. Officers did not need to give lectures on naval architecture. The ship itself was beginning to persuade people. Floors that once felt level now carried a suggestion of tilt. Walking changed slightly. Perspectives shifted. The waterline no longer looked where it should. These are subtle signs until they are not, and Titanic was moving through that transition minute by minute. As the boats continued to leave, the social reality of the disaster became visible in another way. Separation. Families were being split in real time, often without the comforting fiction that they would easily reunite in an hour. Women descended in boats while husbands stood above on deck. Children were passed down. Final instructions were shouted. Some men joked, because joking was easier than saying goodbye honestly. Some women believed, or pretended to believe, they would see their loved ones again once help arrived. Others knew by tone alone that this might be the last exchange. The deck was full of these small private tragedies happening in parallel, which is one reason the atmosphere became more strained even before outright panic took hold. Fear was no longer abstract. It had faces and names. There were also people who tried to refuse the logic of the evacuation altogether. Not everyone wanted a place in a lifeboat under those conditions. Some were simply too slow to believe. Some were physically reluctant to climb in. Some were emotionally paralyzed. Some, particularly among the men, may have chosen to stay back out of duty, stubbornness, fatalism, or the increasingly realistic sense that places should go to others first. Titanic's deck was not occupied solely by those desperately lunging for escape. It also held many people trying, in different ways, to behave correctly according to some code even as the situation was beginning to outrun all codes. Still, the strain was mounting. Officers had to raise voices more often. The empty spaces in earlier boats became painful in retrospect, because later boats would be sought with increasing desperation. What had once been hesitation now became scarcity. The ship's own lights, once reassuring, began to take on a harsher quality. Instead of saying safety, they now illuminated the fact that this huge vessel, was still alive enough to be seen clearly and yet dying too quickly to save everyone aboard. Light can comfort, but it can also reveal too much. Some accounts suggest that not all parts of the ship experienced the same degree of panic even late into the night. That sounds surprising until one remembers how large Titanic was and how unevenly information spread. On one side of the deck, passengers might be crowding harder around a boat. In another section, people might still be waiting in uncertain lines, hoping for instruction. Down in parts of the ship not yet fully abandoned, some may still have been dressing, gathering belongings, or searching for routes upward. A disaster on a vessel this size was never a single emotional weather system. It was many local climates changing at different rates. And then the boats themselves became witnesses. As they pulled away, those inside could look back and see Titanic from the outside, lit up against the blackness, boats hanging, rockets rising, figures moving along the rails and deck spaces. That view must have been deeply unsettling because it made the ship appear both grand and doomed at the same time. A person in a lifeboat could see the ship's shape more clearly than a person still aboard, and that external view likely accelerated realization. The liner was lower at the bow. She looked wrong in the water. The distance between boat and ship, though small in nautical terms, was enough to strip away some of the interior illusion passengers had lived inside all evening. For those left on deck, the sight of departing boats had the opposite effect. Each one took not only people, but possibility. Once lowered, a boat was no longer an abstract option waiting nearby. It was gone, a dark shape on the water. The people remaining aboard now faced a harsher arithmetic. There would be fewer chances ahead, not more. This is where the panic became more visible. Not necessarily a total mob, but a stronger urgency in movement and voice. Questions turned into demands. Hesitation turned into appeals. Some men attempted to slip into boats, some were turned back. Some officers responded with hard discipline because they believed only firmness could stop the deck from breaking entirely into chaos. The collapsible boats added their own confusion. Unlike the standard lifeboats already hanging in davits, these required more preparation and were not as straightforward to launch. Time spent on them was time spent under worsening conditions. By now, the ship's angle, the cold, and the emotional strain were all increasing. Procedures that might have been manageable at the start of the evacuation were becoming harder to carry out cleanly. Crew fatigue and stress mattered too. These men had been acting continuously under pressure, and pressure narrows judgment even in the disciplined. There is a tendency in later retellings to imagine that panic is always the opposite of dignity, but Titanic complicates that idea. Much of the unfolding panic still wore the clothes of politeness. People queued, argued, pleaded, insisted, obeyed, or delayed within the patterns their society had taught them. The deck did not instantly lose all shape. That almost makes it worse. The catastrophe proceeded through forms of order that were no longer equal to the task. In that sense, the lamps, the uniforms, the music, and the formal instructions all became part of the tragedy. They preserved enough calm to prevent immediate collapse, but not enough power to create enough boats or enough time. And time was now becoming visible in the ship's body. Forward spaces were lower. The sense of slope was clearer. The air felt sharper. Passengers in the boats could hear more clearly now the growing mixture of ship sounds and human sounds coming off Titanic. Those still aboard were living with the knowledge that every minute changed their odds. A boat lowered now might mean life. A delay of even a few minutes might mean facing a ship with too few places left and a deck no longer easy to manage. The unfolding panic was therefore not one moment, but an accumulation. First uncertainty, then persuasion, then visible separation, then scarcity, then the realization that the ship's condition is worsening faster than one's private hopes can justify. By the time this realization had spread widely enough, the boat deck was no longer a place where calm authority could do almost all the work. Fear had joined the process. It was still partly contained by officers, by custom, and by the physical steps of launching boats, but it was there now, unmistakably. It lived in the raised voices, the quickened movements, the last-minute attempts to board, the faces of those watching boats descend without them, and the hardening tone of the men responsible for keeping the deck from tipping into complete disorder. Even so, there remained no clean line between calm and panic. Titanic's evacuation stayed mixed almost to the end. Courage and confusion stood side by side. Obedience and resistance appeared in the same minutes. Tender farewells happened within earshot of harsh commands. The lamp shone on all of it equally, giving the scene a bright clarity that the surrounding sea refused to match. That is one of the reasons this stage of the disaster remained so unsettling. It did not look like a simple collapse. It looked like a great machine of order trying to continue functioning after the facts had already outrun it. And by now, the ship was forcing the issue more bluntly. The remaining boats mattered even more. The distance between deck and water was changing. The angle was no longer something only a sensitive foot might notice. Titanic was moving toward the stage where no amount of lighting, music, or command voice could conceal what was happening. The ship had spent a long time persuading people she was safe. Now, under the same electric glow that had once advertised her modern confidence, she was beginning to reveal the limits of that confidence in a way no one on board could continue to misunderstand for much longer. By this point in the night, Titanic was no longer a ship that merely carried fear in scattered pockets. Fear had begun to settle into the deck itself. It was in the way people moved, in the way they watched the remaining lifeboats, in the way the crew spoke to one another, and in the way the ship answered underfoot. Earlier, passengers could still tell themselves that the danger might be exaggerated, that the cold trip into a boat would prove unnecessary, that the officers were simply taking every precaution on a great liner built to survive problems of this kind. That room for self-comfort was shrinking. The sea had climbed higher. The boats that could be lowered without too much difficulty had mostly gone. The ship's angle was no longer a rumour one could dismiss with a nervous smile. The change was physical now. A person standing on deck did not need a technical explanation anymore. He could feel the ship behaving differently. Walking aft no longer felt quite the same as walking forward. The slight adjustment of balance that had once been easy to ignore now asked for attention. Shoes met planks differently. Railings became more useful. Objects that would normally sit quietly in place had reason to shift. The deck was telling the truth with increasing confidence, and once a ship begins telling the truth through its own shape, the emotional life of everyone aboard changes with it. The cold made all of this harder. That cold has to be understood properly or the scene loses some of its force. This was not the sort of cold a person complains about when stepping outside without gloves to fetch something from the car. It was North Atlantic cold in the middle of the night, sharpened by open water and exposure. The kind that works quickly into fingers, ears, cheeks, and breath. People who had dressed in a hurry were learning that a coat alone did not solve much. Those who came up in evening clothes with a blanket draped over them felt it worse. Women in dresses, men in formal shoes, children wrapped as best they could be, all found themselves standing on the open deck for longer than they expected, while lifeboat places dwindled and the ship gradually surrendered more of its level stability. Cold, Alters thought. That is worth remembering. It narrows attention. It makes people impatient, clumsy, and less able to weigh long-term choices with calm intelligence. When someone is freezing, he wants relief. He wants movement, shelter, instruction that leads somewhere, any end to standing exposed while uncertainty drags on. On Titanic, the cold did not merely add discomfort to the disaster, it changed the emotional pace of it. The longer people remained on deck, the more their bodies urged them to act, to find warmth, to get into a boat, to return inside, to do something other than stand and wait. But the choices available were narrowing, and for many the path to immediate relief was gone. This was the environment in which the band continued to play. The musicians have become one of the most famous parts of the story, and for that reason they are sometimes discussed in a way that feels too tidy, too polished, almost too pleased with its own nobility. Real life on that deck was less neat. The band did not magically solve fear, nor did every note drift over a silent crowd in perfect dignity. What the music did, at least for a time, was hold a certain line against disorder. It gave the ship one more sign of continuity with ordinary life. It told passengers that the social world had not fully broken apart. It provided rhythm where panic would otherwise have filled the air more quickly. That mattered. People in distress listen closely for cues about how frightened they are allowed to become. A crowd does not always decide that on its own. It takes signals from authority, from architecture, from movement, from sound. On Titanic, the music was one of those signals. If musicians are still playing, if officers are still using measured tones, if seamen are still lowering boats in organised sequence, if the lights are still on, then some part of the mind continues to believe that human control remains stronger than chaos. Even when fear is already rising, that belief can postpone its ugliest forms. For the officers, that was useful. For many passengers, it was both useful and dangerous. It is difficult to know exactly what pieces were played, and in what precise order. Memory under conditions like these is imperfect, and later retellings have attached certain melodies to the scene with more confidence than the evidence always allows. But the broad fact is secure enough. Music was present, and it helped create a pocket of order on a deck that was becoming steadily less governable. Imagine hearing it while standing in line near a boat, the wind cutting through your coat, the ship very slightly but unmistakably wrong beneath your feet. A tune rises, perhaps familiar, perhaps chosen because familiarity itself is a form of restraint. Nearby, crew are at work. An officer is repeating that women and children should step forward. Somewhere not far off, a man argues that he should accompany his wife. Someone else is told no. A child begins crying because children cry when adults are frightened, no matter how much the adults try to hide it. Against all of this comes music, calm in a way no one feels internally, but calm enough to steady hands and delay the crowd from becoming a single animal of fear. That is the practical use of it. The sentimental use came later. At the same time, the band's presence also sharpened the unreality of the scene. There is something deeply strange about hearing organised music in a place that is steadily losing its footing in the world. It belongs to a ballroom, a lounge, a reception, a civilized evening. It does not belong on the deck of a sinking liner unless civilization itself is trying, almost stubbornly, to pretend it is still in charge. Titanic in these minutes had that quality. She was still trying to appear like herself. The music helped maintain that appearance, even as the ship's body and the cold air said more and more plainly that appearances were nearly out of the road. Passengers reacted differently to this stage of the night. Some may have found the music comforting. Some may barely have noticed it over the work of getting family into boats, or the private strain of saying what might be a final goodbye. Some may have found it eerie, one more sign that the situation had moved beyond anything ordinary enough to interpret without strain. But it remained part of the atmosphere, just as the cold remained part of the atmosphere, and just as the deck's gradual change in angle now remained part of every movement. By now, more people were beginning to understand that there might not be a place for them. This is a different kind of realization from simply understanding that the ship is in danger. Earlier, the emotional crisis was about belief. Do I believe Titanic might truly sink? Do I believe this boat is necessary? Do I believe the officers are telling me the full story? Now for many, the crisis was becoming mathematical. How many boats remain? How many people are still on deck? How many chances are left? Once fear becomes arithmetic, it grows sharper. It stops being an unease and becomes a count. Men in particular faced a brutal version of this as the policy of women and children first took on its hardest shape. In the earlier boats, some could still tell themselves that later places would open. Some could trust that the process was only beginning. Some could console a frightened wife or daughter with the possibility of reunion in another boat or on a rescue ship. As time passed, and as the ship settled lower, and as the number of remaining boats shrank, The same men had to look at the deck around them and see that the odds were changing against them with every minute. That realization did not always produce outward panic. Sometimes it produced a stiffer posture, a more deliberate politeness, a quietness that was itself a form of strain. But the knowledge was there. Women faced a different version of the same cruelty. To enter a boat often meant leaving someone behind under conditions that no longer allowed much self-deception. Earlier, a woman might step into a lifeboat believing or pretending that her husband would follow shortly. Later, as the ship's angle increased and the remaining places grew fewer, that reassurance became harder to offer and hard to believe. Some still refused to leave. Some had to be urged or lifted. Some obeyed because there was no useful alternative. None of those reactions were simple. None can be dismissed as weakness or irrationality. They were responses to a situation that asked people to separate family under pressure, while the future remained visible enough to dread and uncertain enough to resist. The crew were under growing pressure too. The work of lowering lifeboats becomes more difficult as a ship develops a greater list or trim. Angles affect the handling of boats, the balance of people climbing in, the behaviour of the falls, and the confidence of those performing the launch. What might feel manageable on a level deck with a composed crowd becomes more dangerous as the ship's geometry worsens and the crowd's patience thins. Officers had to keep making decisions while the conditions for good decisions deteriorated around them. At the same time, those still working below were helping hold back total collapse above. The lights remained on longer than many might have expected, which meant the ship continued to look controlled, even as she was running out of control in every meaningful sense. That light illuminated the deck where the band played, where passengers clustered, where boats were launched, and where the cold worked steadily into people's bodies. Had the electrical system failed sooner, the atmosphere would have changed instantly from formal emergency to something much rougher. Instead, Titanic remained visible, and in remaining visible she prolonged the half-civilized quality of the scene. But the ship was losing the argument with her own passengers one visible sign at a time. The bow was lower. The forward spaces were more obviously near the water. The deck underfoot was less cooperative. More and more people on board had now felt enough, seen enough, or been denied enough to know that this was not heading toward a neat conclusion. What had begun as confusion had become dread. The cold added a particular cruelty for those already in lifeboats. Looking back at the ship from the water, they saw Titanic lit up in the darkness, larger than life and strangely calm-looking from a distance, even as they themselves sat cramped in open boats, exposed to the same freezing air and far closer to the sea they feared. Some boats had left underfilled, and those in them now had to live with the sight of the great liner still crowded with people. That memory must have been unbearable. They were safer than those still aboard, but safety in an open boat on the North Atlantic was a hard kind of safety, and it came mixed with guilt, fear, and helplessness. They could hear music, they could hear shouts, they could see the ship's position changing. They could do very little about any of it. Back on deck, the social divisions that had organised Titanic from the start were beginning to matter less than the plain facts of who stood where and when. Yet traces of those divisions remained. Some reached the remaining boats more easily than others. Some were better informed. Some had earlier access to open deck spaces and instructions. Even in crisis, the ship did not become fully equal, but the growing tilt and the growing fear were creating a rougher democracy than the voyage had offered before. Coal does not care about ticket price, nor does gravity when a ship begins to pitch you forward by degrees. One can imagine the sensations minute by minute. At first, you're merely aware that standing feels slightly different. Then you notice that people tend to brace a little more when moving. Then you see a chair, a crate, or some small object no longer resting quite where it should. Then you realise that the ship's front looks lower against the horizon. Then you stop needing confirmation from anyone else. The body understands before the mind fully admits it. Titanic was tilting, and with that tilt came a change in mood no music could reverse. This does not mean the band was pointless. It means the band was human. It represented an effort to keep one kind of order alive while another kind was failing. That effort deserves respect precisely because it was limited. No one playing on that deck could produce more lifeboats. No tune could flatten the planks again or warm the air or reverse the flooding below. Yet the musicians stood there and did what they knew how to do, in a context where useful action could take forms other than technical rescue. Keeping fear 1 degree lower for 10 more minutes may have saved lives. Keeping people from surging too early or abandoning discipline too quickly mattered. Music in such a setting is not decoration. It is part of the ship's final attempt to keep people governable. Still, there comes a point when even governable fear becomes too large to hold inside ceremony. Titanic was approaching that point. The remaining lifeboats were fewer and more difficult to manage. More of those left behind understood that their options were drying up. Officers had to act more sharply. Some men made bolder attempts to board. Some were turned back. Some arguments ended in forceful refusal because there was no longer time for patient explanation. The ship's change in angle made every delay more expensive. The calm voice of early evacuation was giving way to the clipped tone of diminishing margin. The cold and the tilt worked together in a particularly ugly way. As the deck sloped more, people had to move with greater care, at exactly the moment when cold was making them less nimble. Hands numbed, muscles tightened. Breath smoked in the air. Clothing that had seemed sufficient an hour earlier now felt thin. People huddled closer, but closeness could not give them enough heat. The ship's warmth was inside, yet going inside was no longer a real solution. Some probably still tried, returning briefly for possessions or shelter, only to find that returning upward became more urgent, more difficult or more frightening than before. There is also the matter of sound. Titanic at this stage was not silent. Even with music playing, the ship carried a growing language of strain. Orders from officers, calls from crew, the creak and movement of rigging and davits, footsteps on angled decks, the murmur of frightened voices. Somewhere below, machinery still working under impossible conditions. The sea itself closer than before to spaces it had no right to reach. A listener in one place might hear mostly music and disciplined voices. A listener in another might hear only urgency. Together these sounds created the atmosphere of a ship not yet broken open in public, but no longer able to disguise the pressure building inside it. The men who remained behind, family in the boats, had more time now to think than anyone should have in such circumstances. That is another cruelty of the deck in these minutes. There were bursts of action, yes, but also intervals in which a man might stand near the rail, watching a boat move away carrying his wife and children, then turn back to a ship that had fewer remaining chances than before. The cold kept him alert. The tilt kept him honest. The music, if still audible, gave him nothing practical to hold. All he had was time enough to understand and not enough to change the outcome. Some chose to help. Some stood by officers or seamen. Some moved women forward, steadied people stepping into boats, or gave up places they might have taken by force. Titanic's last deck scenes are not made only of panic. They are also made of people deciding in specific hard seconds who they want to be when there may be no rescue left for them. That should not be romanticised beyond recognition, but it should not be flattened either. Crisis reveals ugly behaviour and decent behaviour at once, and Titanic had plenty of both. For those who were still unsure only a little earlier, the deck itself had now become persuasive beyond denial. One did not need to be an officer. One did not need Thomas Andrews with calculations in hand. The ship was leaning farther, the boats were fewer. The cold was harsher because waiting had become longer and hope had become thinner. The band's music, instead of making the scene feel normal, could now make it feel more strange, because the normal world had plainly expired while some of its habits remained standing. And yet those habits continued for a while, because they were all the ship had left. Lamps, music, commands, procedure, the formal language of loading and lowering. the insistence that women and children step forward, the attempt to keep the crowd from becoming a rush. Titanic was still conducting herself as if disaster could be managed through method, even as the angle underfoot showed method was nearly out of time. Soon the ship would move into her harshest stage, when the lights, the music, the order, and even the possibility of standing in any ordinary way would all come under direct assault from the sinking itself. For now the cold deepened. The band played on in one form or another, and the tilting decks taught every remaining soul aboard the lesson that had been climbing up from the flooded compartments all night. The ship was no longer carrying them across the Atlantic. She was carrying them toward her final minutes, and there would not be enough space, enough warmth, or enough order left for everyone still standing there. By the time Titanic entered her final minutes before the lights failed, the night had changed character again. Earlier, fear had worked its way through the ship in uneven currents. Some people had understood quickly, others had needed persuasion, some had stepped into boats still half convinced that the great liner behind them would remain afloat until rescue arrived. Some had stood on deck hoping there was more time than there really was. That long stretch of uncertainty was ending now. The ship was no longer asking people to interpret small signs. She was showing them, in plain physical terms, that the last part of the night had arrived. The bow had dropped much farther. Water had reached areas of the ship that no one would once have imagined seeing touched by the sea while the vessel still floated as a recognisable thing. Walking was no longer simply awkward. It required effort and attention. Passengers and crew moving across the decks now had to lean into the angle, brace against surfaces, catch themselves on railings, and judge each step with more care than the polished decks of a great liner had ever demanded before. The tilt gave everything a different meaning. A door was no longer just a door. A stairway was no longer just a stairway. A short distance could become difficult, especially in the cold, especially in bulky clothing, especially for children, the elderly, and anyone already shaken by the realization that there were very few boats left to trust. The boat deck itself had become a place where order still existed, but only in increasingly thin strips. Officers and crew were working on the last available lifeboats and collapsibles. The earlier rhythm of loading and lowering had been replaced by something more strained, more urgent, less forgiving of delay. There was less room now for soft persuasion. The ship's angle, the cold and the visible shortage of places had stripped away much of the earlier illusion that there would be time for everybody to be sorted neatly into safety. Time was now a thing people could feel slipping away through their own bodies. It was in the faster breathing, the harder voices, the way gloved hands no longer seemed quick enough, and the way every minute made the ship physically less manageable. Those final boats, especially the collapsibles, brought their own problems. They were not all hanging ready in the same straightforward way as the earlier lifeboats. Some had to be prepared in worsening conditions with the deck no longer level, and the crew under enormous pressure. Men worked with rope, canvas, tackle, and frozen fingers, while the ship moved farther down by the bow. Procedures that might have seemed routine on a level deck in daylight had become slow and difficult in the middle of the night on a dying ship. Every snag mattered. Every delay was heavier now. The officers knew it. The crew knew it. The passengers waiting nearby knew it too, even if no one needed to say it plainly. The lights still burned through all this, and that fact continued to shape the scene. Titanic, fully illuminated against the dark sea, looked almost impossibly grand for a ship so close to losing control of herself. Her portholes and deck lamps gave the impression of life continuing inside, and in some places it still was, in the most technical sense. Power remained. Some systems remained. Men below were still keeping the ship going in ways that those on deck could only understand indirectly. The lights offered one last form of order, one last signal that the vessel had not yet fallen completely into the Atlantic's hands. But by now the lights had also become a kind of cruelty. They revealed too much. They illuminated faces strained by cold and fear. They showed the tilt more clearly. They lit the ropes, the boats, the sloping deck, the crowded spaces where too many people remained. A dark ship would have been terrifying. A brightly lit sinking ship was something stranger. It made the disaster impossible to misunderstand while also making the ship look almost capable enough to save herself, which she no longer was. The band, if still playing in some form during these last minutes, could no longer carry the same effect it had earlier. Music at the beginning of an evacuation helps hold people together. Music near the end, when the ship's condition is visible beyond denial, changes its role. It no longer competes with disbelief because disbelief has nearly run out. Instead, it stands against the rising roughness of the moment. It tries to keep fear from breaking into something blind. It gives those on board one last piece of recognizable civilization, while the ship beneath them slides away from every civilized promise she had made. Whether passengers truly listened by then is another matter. Some may have. Some likely heard only fragments. Others were too occupied with the final boats, with finding family members, with searching for officers, with trying to understand whether any route to survival remained at all. By now, many of the people left aboard understood that there would not be enough lifeboat places for them. That knowledge is different from fear. Fear leaves room for luck. Fear says something terrible may happen. This stage had moved farther than that. More and more passengers and crew were beginning to stand inside the harder knowledge that their survival would depend on something other than an orderly seat in a boat. Some men had already accepted this. Some were still looking for a chance at the collapsibles. Some were helping others, because helping gave shape to minutes that otherwise might have been unbearable. A few may still have been clinging to the hope that rescue was seconds away, but hope now had to fight what the ship itself was showing everyone. The bow was low, the deck was steepening, the boats were almost gone. For those already in the waterborne boats, the view back toward Titanic must have become more dreadful by the minute. She was still lit, still huge, still full of people, but lower now, more wrong in the water. The stern seemed higher, the bow darker and closer to the sea. The shape that had looked so complete earlier in the night now carried the unmistakable geometry of failure. Those in the boats could hear more too. Not only commands and perhaps bits of music, but the wider sound of the ship entering a more desperate stage. Voices travel differently over cold water at night. So do metallic sounds. A call from deck, a shouted order, the movement of something breaking loose, the shifting language of a ship under strain. The people in the boats were safe only in a narrow sense. They were alive and off the ship, but they were close enough to witness the last minutes of a still illuminated world they had only recently believed could never disappear. Back on deck, movement had become more difficult in certain areas. Staircases and passageways that had once offered easy circulation were now affected by angle and urgency. Men trying to free collapsibles worked against time and against the ship's changing position. Some accounts describe crew and passengers trying to get the last boats ready, while the forward part of the ship was becoming dangerously low, and the waterline was advancing into spaces that had been dry not long before. The most sobering part of this is how long Titanic still looked like a ship, while also no longer functioning like one. Her outlines remained, her lights remained, her decks, though slanted, were still standing surfaces. Yet the logic of ordinary shipboard life had broken down. She no longer carried people safely. She no longer obeyed the timetable of travel. She had become a narrowing platform on which people were trying to arrange survival in the final available minutes. Captain Smith moved through these last stages in a way that later memory has struggled to pin down with certainty, and that uncertainty itself feels fitting. In a disaster like this, leadership is both visible and swallowed by the event. There are reports of him helping direct the evacuation, urging men to do their duty, releasing crew from strict formalities, and moving through the deck spaces where authority still mattered. Whether every detail repeated later is exact matters less than the broader truth that command in the last minutes becomes less about grand gestures and more about trying to keep a collapsing situation from collapsing all at once. Officers on either side of the boat deck were doing much the same. Their commands had to compete now not with politeness and hesitation, but with the ship's own steepening demands. The sea itself was approaching people now not as an idea, not as distant blackness beyond the rails, but as a physical presence climbing toward them. That changes a crowd. Earlier, fear had time to argue with itself. Now the argument was shorter. Passengers could see where the water was relative to parts of the ship they knew should stand higher. They could feel the deck under them demanding effort. They could see the remaining lifeboat chances dwindling into nearly nothing. There is a moment in many disasters when the environment stops supporting private denial. Titanic was inside that moment now. As the stern rose higher, the mechanical and structural life of the ship also changed. Objects inside would have begun shifting more noticeably. Furniture, equipment, loose items, anything not firmly secured now had reason to move. Below, the flooded forward sections were dragging the ship into a more dramatic trim. The machinery spaces farther aft and the electrical system still held on for a while, but they were being carried toward an impossible demand. The ship's structure was being asked to endure positions and stresses it had not been built to hold indefinitely. The men remaining aboard did not need a lesson in naval architecture to sense that the ship was straining in new ways. That strain likely made itself known in sound before some passengers understood it intellectually. Great ships speak through their frames. Metal under changing load does not stay entirely quiet. There were reports later of roaring, rumbling, cracking, or deep internal noises in Titanic's final stages. Some of these may have come just after the blackout or closer to the breakup, but even before the lights went out, the ship must have felt less composed, less self-contained. A vessel that had crossed the Atlantic with dignified steadiness was now moving into a posture no great liner was meant to take. The sensation of standing on something once controlled and now turning uncertain is hard to overstate. It works through the feet, the knees, the spine. It tells the body before the mind forms the words. In these minutes, human behaviour split in recognisable ways. Some people became more active, trying to find any remaining route into a collapsible or toward the stern. Some became fixated on particular loved ones. Some likely froze, not because they lacked courage, but because the mind, when faced with too many rapidly worsening facts, sometimes pauses instead of choosing. Crew members continued helping where they could. Some officers and seamen fought to launch the final boats. Other crew tried to clear deck spaces, direct women and children, or keep people from rushing too soon. There were men who must have known by then that their chances were little to none, and yet continued performing tasks because tasks were better than waiting empty-handed for the sea. The ship's class division still mattered in the background, but the final minutes before the lights went out were increasingly shaped by position rather than ticket. Where are you now? Which deck are you on? Are you near the final boats, or cut off from them? Are you aft, or forward? Are you with children? Can you move easily on a sloping deck? Have you found an officer or not? Architecture and class had already shaped who arrived where and when, but in the last stretch the ship's changing angle began to erase some distinctions in the most brutal way. All aboard were now subject to the same deck, the same cold, the same diminishing order. Somewhere in this period the final wireless calls were sent or fading toward their end. The ship had been calling for help, and help was on the way in the broad sense, but not in the useful one. That is one of the bitterest truths of Titanic. Rescue existed as a fact, but not as a timely one. Nearby or not, the Carpathia and any other responding vessels could not simply appear beside the ship, because the need had become unbearable. The Atlantic does not shorten because human beings urgently wish it to. So even as Titanic remained lit and seemingly substantial in the darkness, she was moving beyond the point at which external rescue could arrive, in time to alter the final minutes aboard. On deck, the last collapsibles became magnets for desperate hope. There are accounts of chaotic efforts around them, particularly as the ship's angle increased and the line between procedure and improvisation blurred. In earlier phases, officers could work from practiced command. In this phase, command had to coexist with failing physical conditions. A boat that is difficult to free on a level deck becomes much more difficult when the deck is sloping. The crowd is strained and the sea is visibly close. Yet people still worked at them, because any boat, however awkwardly launched, represented a chance. The lights continuing through this stage is part of what makes it so haunting. Titanic did not vanish into darkness before a final visible struggle. She remained illuminated long enough for those aboard and those already in the boats to see the ship's last posture with painful clarity. The rows of portholes and deck lights, the shape of the stern against the sky, the figures moving on the angled decks, all of this remained visible. Light gave witness. It made the last minutes before blackout feel less like a disappearance and more like a prolonged exposure. The ship could not hide. Neither could the people still on her. And then comes the part where time seems to compress. In a chronological sense, there were still minutes. In human experience, however, those minutes must have felt shorter and faster than anything before them. The bow was far down, the stern was climbing, the final boats were nearly all dealt with. More of the people remaining understood what remained for them, which was not much. The cold was severe. The deck was forcing everyone into new postures. The sounds of the ship had changed. Whatever order could still be imposed was now fighting against a vessel whose own body was overturning the terms of the evacuation. If you were standing there then, you would no longer be asking whether the ship would survive. That question was dead. You would not be asking whether the lifeboats were truly necessary. That question was dead too. The only live questions were narrower and harsher. Is there one more boat? Is there a way onto that collapsible? Should I jump if the water comes higher? Should I stay with this person or move? Should I go aft? How much time is left? Human beings can continue thinking in very practical ways, even in the worst moments, and that practicality is one reason the scene never becomes as simple as mass screaming. There is too much to decide in too little time. The deck angle must have made each of these decisions feel more urgent. A small slope can be managed while thinking. A greater one makes you think with your muscles because balance itself becomes part of the problem. Women in long skirts, men in dress shoes, children, stewards, seamen, all were now negotiating not only danger but geometry. The ship was ceasing to be a platform and becoming something closer to a steepening surface that still carried lights, still carried people, and still had not yet fully given way. Then, at last, the electrical life of the ship approached its end. Titanic had remained lit far longer than many might expect from a vessel in such condition, which speaks again to the labour and engineering below. But power on a sinking ship is not eternal. As the flooding advanced and the ship's orientation worsened, the systems supplying light and electricity were pushed beyond what they could sustain. Those still on deck may have sensed that this too was nearing an end. Perhaps through flicker, perhaps through sound, perhaps through nothing more than the intuition that the ship could not continue looking this composed for much longer. For the people in the lifeboats, the waiting must have become unbearable. They could see the stern rising higher. They could see the whole ship looking increasingly unnatural. They could hear distant cries and commands carried over the water. The lights made Titanic visible almost like a stage set, but one whose last act had become too terrible to watch without also watching. They knew, or at least many now knew, that the blackout would mark a terrible change. A lit ship sinking is one kind of horror. A dark one is another. Darkness would remove the last visual order and leave only outline, sound, and the sea. Back aboard, the final minutes before that darkness were the last moments in which Titanic still looked in any strong sense like the modern ship she had set out to be. The lights, though now fragile in their continuation, still connected her to the world of engineering, routine, and human control. Men were still moving with purpose. Some women and children had already gone. Some men remained where they had chosen to remain. Others were still searching for any chance left. The cold bit harder. The deck pulled steeper. The sea drew closer. the ship's sounds deepened. The whole vessel seemed to hold itself in a posture that could not continue much longer. And then, as the strain reached the point where steel, electricity and flooding were no longer willing to cooperate, the lights that had made Titanic look almost defiantly alive through so much of the disaster were nearing the instant when they would fail. The bright windows, the deck lamps, the electric glow that had accompanied the loading of lifeboats and the movement of crew and the final efforts around the collapsibles, all of it was approaching its break. For those still aboard, that meant the last veil of normality was about to be torn away. For those in the boats, it meant the great ship they were watching would stop being a lit world and become a dark shape in open water. In that suspended stretch, just before the blackout, Titanic still held her form, still held her people, and still held the final fraction of visible order she'd left, while the Atlantic waited for the moment when even the light would no longer stand between the living and the end of the ship. When the lights finally failed, Titanic changed from a ship in visible distress into a shape people had to understand by outline, sound, and instinct. That moment mattered, because artificial light had done more than illuminate the decks. It had held the whole disaster inside a frame of order. As long as the ship was glowing, she still looked in some stubborn way like the modern liner she had been built to be. Once that glow vanished, she became something else. The people still aboard were no longer standing inside a lit environment governed by visible rules, commands, ropes, deck lamps, and rows of windows. They were now on a darkened structure at a severe angle in freezing air above a black sea with very little left between them and the water. For those already in the lifeboats, the blackout was just as terrible. They had been watching Titanic as a bright, enormous thing against the night, the lights allowing them to judge her shape and see that she was sinking lower by the minute. When the power went out, that image changed at once. The ship did not vanish entirely. Her outline remained, and the stars behind her may even have made the silhouette more severe. But a dark ship is harder to read. It is easier to fear what you cannot see clearly, and there was now far less to see. Where moments earlier there had been windows and deck lights marking the body of the liner, there was suddenly a much blacker mass in the darkness, interrupted by what little light still came from the sky and the pale wash of the sea below. On board, the loss of light made movement far more dangerous. The deck was already badly angled. Many of the remaining passengers and crew had been trying to keep their footing even before the blackout. In darkness, that became harder. Railings mattered more. Distance felt less dependable. A section of deck you might have crossed with effort a few minutes earlier could now be a place where you stumbled, slid, or collided with others. Clothing, too, became more of a burden. Heavy coats, life jackets, long skirts, formal shoes, and layers put on in haste all interfered with balance. The great ship had become, in her last moments, not only a sinking vessel but a failing surface, and now that surface could no longer even be read clearly by the people on it. Accounts from survivors describe confusion, noise, and the ship's stern rising higher, though exactly how each person experienced the final plunge varied with where they stood. That variation matters. Titanic was so large and the situation so chaotic by this point that no single witness saw everything from one perfect position. Some were near the stern, some were closer to the sides, some had already gone overboard or been swept into the sea, some watched from boats at a distance. What emerged later from testimony was not one tidy image, but a collection of views that overlap in important ways. The ship rose more steeply. There was tremendous noise. People lost footing. The final descent was violent and confusing. These are the points where memory agrees most strongly. One of the long-debated questions in the Titanic story concerned whether the ship broke apart before disappearing. For years, some people doubted it. Others insisted they had seen it. When the wreck was found on the ocean floor in 1985 with the bow and stern lying separated, the basic issue was settled. Titanic had indeed broken in two. That does not mean every survivor saw the breakup in exactly the same way or at exactly the same moment, because darkness, distance, and panic distort perception. But the ship did not go down in one intact piece. She failed structurally during those final minutes, and that failure helps explain both the sounds described and the pattern in which the wreck was later discovered. This is a crucial point because it tells us that Titanic's last moments were not simply a graceful tilt followed by disappearance. They were rougher than that. The ship had already been subjected to enormous stress as the bow filled and pulled downward while the stern rose higher into the air. A vessel that large is not meant to hold such a position for long. Steel, frames and internal structures can take only so much before they begin to give way. In the final stage, the loads on the hull became too great. The ship's body failed under them. From the deck, this would not have felt like an engineering lesson. It would have felt like the ship becoming less ship-like by the second. Sounds of strain, sudden changes in angle, the sense that the structure itself was no longer one coherent, trustworthy thing. People clinging to railings or deck fittings might have felt movement change beneath them. Those in the water or in boats would have seen the outline alter in ways that were difficult to interpret cleanly in the dark. Some later described the stern seeming to pause high in the air. Others described a great noise, then a change in the shape of the ship. These differences in testimony are not surprising. In moments like this, no one is calmly taking notes. They are trying to survive or trying to understand what they are seeing through fear, cold, darkness, and distance. The people still on board at this stage were in an almost impossible position. Lifeboat chances were, for most, already gone. The stern offered the highest ground and therefore seemed the best place to remain above the water for as long as possible. That natural movement aft would have concentrated people there, especially as the bow sank lower and the forward part of the ship became more obviously doomed. But a crowd moving toward the stern of a ship that is rising at the bow-down angle of Titanic's last minutes is not moving on a normal deck. It is climbing, scrambling, bracing and slipping on a surface turning steadily more severe. Imagine trying to move upward while the deck beneath you is becoming a slope, in darkness, surrounded by others doing the same, while the ship itself groans and the sea is only moments away from reaching where you stand. You're wearing clothes not meant for climbing. Your hands may be numb with cold. The life jacket around your chest may help later, but for now it adds bulk and awkwardness. There is shouting somewhere. There may be prayer. There may be silence from some people and panic from others. There may be crew still trying to direct movement, though direction itself is becoming less useful because the ship has moved beyond the stage where order can save many more lives. The last minutes are not a controlled evacuation now. They are the final contest between gravity, structure, and human bodies trying not to be taken by the water too soon. Some accounts suggest that as the stern rose, people slid down the deck toward the sea. That makes practical sense. Once the angle becomes steep enough, standing in place is difficult, and moving downward without intending to becomes likely. Railings, deck fixtures, and any solid projection become temporary anchors. People would have gripped what they could. Some would lose hold. Others would choose moments to jump rather than remain attached to a structure they believed might pull them down. There is no neat heroic script for such choices. Some jumped because they thought it offered a better chance. Some stayed because jumping into black freezing water from that height seemed just as likely to kill them immediately. Both responses are easy to understand. The breakup itself would have introduced a new kind of violence into the scene. A great ship separating under stress does not do so quietly. There would have been noise, perhaps described as cracking, thunderous tearing, or metallic roar. Survivors used different words, but all were reaching for the same problem: how to describe the sound of a ship failing as a ship. Once the hull split, the bow and stern no longer behaved as one piece. The bow, already full of water, would continue its downward path. The stern, relieved of some of the immediate weight dragging it, likely settled back somewhat before rising again into a more vertical position for its own final plunge. That sequence is still studied in detail, but the broad shape of it is widely accepted. Titanic's death came in stages, not in one clean movement. For those in the lifeboats, the break-up and final descent must have been horrifying in a particularly helpless way. They were near enough to hear, near enough to see the outline changing, and near enough to know that hundreds of people were still aboard or in the water, yet far enough away that there was almost nothing they could do. The decision not to row immediately back toward the sinking ship is one of the most painful features of the disaster, but it was shaped by fear that the boats themselves could be swamped by desperate swimmers or drawn into the chaos near the hull. That fear was not irrational. A small, overloaded or unstable lifeboat on black freezing water is itself fragile. The people in those boats were not making choices from comfort. They were making them from within cold, shock, darkness, and the knowledge that the sea around them would soon be full of people. When the stern rose into the air, Titanic would have become visible in a way no passenger had ever imagined during the voyage. The great propellers, usually hidden underwater, may have been exposed. The underside of the stern, the shape of the ship from an angle never meant to be seen, would have confirmed beyond all argument that the liner was at the end of her life. There is something especially grim about that image. A ship designed to cross an ocean, in dignified balance, forced into a nearly upright posture, stripped of her ordinary relationship with the sea, about to go under not as transport but as wreck. Some survivors recalled a pause before the final plunge, though again such descriptions vary. In an event measured in terror and darkness, a few seconds can feel long. A brief hesitation in the ship's motion can seem like a pause, a hanging moment, even if in strict chronological terms it is very short. That sensation matters because it means the final descent was not necessarily experienced as one uninterrupted sweep. There may have been moments when people thought the stern had stopped rising, or that it had reached its highest point, only for the next movement to begin. In those suspended seconds, whatever hope remained would not have been rational hope of rescue anymore. It would have been the raw hope that clings to any delay and disaster, even when delay changes nothing. Then came the final submergence. When Titanic slipped beneath the sea, the movement of the stern downward would have drawn people with it, or thrown them off depending on where they stood and how they lost contact with the ship. Some were likely carried under with the vessel for a time before rising, if they rose at all. Others may have been pitched clear. The ocean at that point was not merely cold, it was lethally cold. Cold enough to disable people with frightening speed. Falling into it was not like entering water during a summer emergency or a harbour accident. It was entering a medium that attacked the body at once. Breathing changed immediately. Muscles began to fail. Shock, pain, and disorientation arrived fast. Even strong swimmers could do little in such conditions, especially at night, and in a life jacket that kept them afloat but could not keep them warm. The final disappearance of the ship did not bring silence. It brought a new sound. Survivors spoke of cries from the water, and that part of the story is among the hardest to read or imagine. Once Titanic was gone, the sea was full of people who had been on the deck only moments earlier. Some had life jackets, some did not. Some were injured, some had jumped from great height, some had been swept in during the breakup or final plunge. They called out in the darkness to lifeboats, to one another, to anyone who might still help. The ship that had held them above the Atlantic was gone. In its place was a field of human voices spread across freezing water. That sound has stayed with the disaster perhaps as deeply as any image. Not because it lasted forever. It did not. It faded, and the fading is part of what makes it so terrible. In water that cold, people lose the ability to keep fighting for very long. The cries diminished as hypothermia and cold shock took hold. Lifeboat survivors later remembered this as one of the most unbearable parts of the night, and it is easy to understand why. To sit in a small boat, hearing hundreds of voices in darkness, unable or unwilling to row immediately into the mass of them for fear of capsizing, must have felt like being made to witness a boundary of human helplessness. The sea after the sinking was not instantly still in a simple sense. There would have been debris, furniture, pieces of wood, cork life jackets, and the disturbed water left by the ship's final plunge. There is often discussion about whether Titanic's descent created a strong suction at the surface. Survivor testimony suggests some people feared being pulled under, and some experienced turbulence or movement near the sinking ship. Large objects descending can disturb surrounding water, though popular exaggerations sometimes turn this into a neat dramatic effect. What matters more than the precise popular image is that the area near the ship's final descent was dangerous in several ways. Debris moved, water shifted, people struggled. The wreckage field at the surface began forming almost immediately, long before the wreckage field on the ocean floor would settle into its final shape. The stern's own path after submerging was not the end of Titanic's destruction, only the end of the visible ship. As the separated sections plunged thousands of meters downward, the pressure and forces involved continued to damage them. But the people in lifeboats could not know that. Their world was now reduced to darkness, freezing air, frightened survivors in open boats, and the fact that where the Titanic had just stood lit against the sky, there was now only night, debris, and voices. Those who survived in the lifeboats entered a new kind of waiting after the sinking. Before, they had been watching the ship. Now they were listening to the water and the cries and trying to judge what to do. Some boats kept away. One or two eventually returned or approached enough to rescue a small number of people from the water, but far fewer than had gone in. This, again, is one of the most difficult moral landscapes in the disaster. It is easy to say from shore or from a comfortable chair that every boat should have rushed back. It is harder to say that from inside a fragile, partially filled lifeboat on a freezing sea in darkness, with the real fear that a crowd of desperate swimmers could swamp the craft and kill those already inside. The choices made that night were made in fear and exhaustion, not in ideal moral conditions. By the time the cries faded, the disaster had entered a quieter horror. The ship was gone. The living were scattered in boats. The dead and dying were in the water, already drifting silent. The stars remained above. The sea, which had looked so calm earlier, was now a place of wreckage and waiting. That contrast is one reason Titanic continues to occupy memory so strongly. The setting was not stormy chaos. It was calm enough, at least on the surface, that human loss sounded all the more exposed against it. Looking back with later evidence, we can say more clearly what happened in those final minutes than the survivors themselves could on the night. We know the ship broke apart. We know the bow and stern lie separated on the ocean floor. We know the descent through the water column and the impact with the seabed further damaged the wreck. We know that Titanic's design, for all its advances, could not survive the pattern of flooding caused by the iceberg. We know that the lifeboat shortage turned a sinking into a mass casualty disaster. We know the nearest helpful rescue came too late. But there is a danger in knowing all this too neatly. It can make the final minutes feel over-explained, when for those who lived them, they were a blur of darkness, metal, angle, cold, and decisions made too late or with too little room. The phrase "slipped beneath the sea" can sound almost too gentle if one is not careful. There was nothing gentle about it for the people involved. The ship's final descent included violence, structural failure, and human bodies thrown into freezing water. Yet the phrase persists because from a distance, from a lifeboat, from memory shaped by shock, there may indeed have been a moment when the vast outline of Titanic simply lowered and went away, leaving the sky where she had been. That contrast between the violence at close range and the almost simple disappearance at a distance captures something true. The end of a giant ship is not one experience. It is many experiences happening at once depending on where you stand. And perhaps that is the real answer to what happened in Titanic's final minutes. Not one perfect cinematic sequence, but a layered collapse. The lights failed, the deck steepened. The last boats were fought over or freed, the ship broke under stress, the stern rose. People jumped, slipped, clung, or were thrown into the sea. The great liner vanished, cries spread across the water, then they faded. What remained were lifeboats, debris, shock, cold, and the long wait for rescue under a sky that looked far too calm for what had just happened. Even after the ship was gone, the night did not end quickly for the survivors. They still had to stay alive in the boats, still had to keep from freezing, still had to look out into the darkness where others had been only minutes before. Dawn would come later. Carpathia would come later. Lists of the living and the missing would come later. Public inquiry, blame, memory, legend, and film would all come much later. In the immediate sense, the sinking left behind not closure but aftermath. The end of Titanic was not the end of the night. It was the beginning of a colder, quieter stretch in which survival itself became the next task. So when we speak of Titanic slipping beneath the sea, we should remember both sides of that truth. From afar she disappeared into darkness. Up close, she failed noisily, unevenly, and with terrible consequences for those still on her. The sea took the ship in pieces. The people left above it in small boats were left with an image and a sound they would carry for the rest of their lives. The shape of the world's grandest liner going down into black water, and the human voices that followed after her into the cold night before even those were gone.